Welcome to the Research to Practice Transit Symposium. I am the assistant organizer for today, Chad Riding from Caltrans Division of Rail and Mass Transportation. Thank yous to our host, Caltrans, University of Florida Transportation Institute, the T-Score University Transportation Center, and the American Public Transportation Association. We have a great agenda for today. You can find the agenda at the symposium website here. We also have this, we are starting off with some opening remarks by Mary Leary. Then we're moving to a session on accessibility and equity with international speakers. Then we have a break, and then moving on to a panel discussion on Florida Transit Rail, followed by a speaker session on travel trends in the COVID era. And rounding off today is a speaker session on transit data and technology. Thanks to our sponsors again. And thank you to the steering committee who put this together and organized it. It was a lot of work, and we are all very grateful to their participation. Thank you to today's participants, the speakers, panelists, and moderators. For those of you who are members of the American Institute of Certified Planners, there is certification maintenance credit offered through AICP, and you can find that at this website. You can also search for them on planning.org's AICP certification maintenance site. If you have any questions for the panelists or experiencing any technical issues, please feel free to email me at chad.writing@dot.ca.gov. Alternatively, you can leave a message in the YouTube comment section. So thank you all, and I will turn it over to Mary Leary for the opening comments for today.
Well, thank you to the sponsors, the steering committee, and to all of you for this opportunity to kick off the afternoon sessions for the Research to Practice Symposium. It's truly an honor to represent and share some perspectives on the importance of research to practice for the Federal Transit Administration. At FTA, our mission is to improve public transportation for America's communities, and our vision is that America's world-class public transportation systems ensures access and mobility for all. To make this happen, though, it's critical to constantly be looking to the future to assess where opportunities exist to innovate, transform, and improve our systems through not only wise investments in research projects, but also in a robust research to practice series of activities to help the almost 7,000 transit agencies find, understand, and utilize the results of research programs. At the Department of Transportation, we're focusing on achieving 5 major strategic goals: to further safety in our nation's transportation system, to drive economic strength and modernization to create jobs and further U.S. businesses, to address equity to ensure racial and broad equitable access to transportation resources, to support climate and sustainability by getting to zero carbon emissions within a resilient transportation system, and leading transformation across our nation by building back better and future-proofing transportation systems. In FTA's Office of Research, Demonstration, and Innovation, our mission and goals are built upon these 5 DOT strategic goals. The mission of our Public Transportation Innovation Program is to enable a robust public transportation network that connects communities and protects the environment. We will achieve this by focusing on 3 new goals, and I see that later you will be talking about performance measures, and we are working to develop measures for these 3 new goals through our data analytics initiative. These goals are first and foremost supporting a safe and secure transit system across the U.S. while increasing equitable accessible mobility and ensuring environmentally sustainable systems. So it's very timely to speak with you today on the topic of research to practice, as just yesterday, a competitive opportunity we released seeking a partner to work with us in this area just closed. We're looking forward to seeing the applications and choosing a good partner to assist us in creating a new and expanded research to practice initiative. We currently foster research to practice by supporting peer-to-peer exchanges, funding communities of practice, encouraging recipients of our research to present at industry conferences, just like this, supporting independent evaluations, ensuring data management plans are put in place, and posting updates on our website. But we think we can do more. However, first, we want to understand the ways that our public transportation stakeholders prefer to consume and use information about research projects. So our Research to Practice initiative seeks to spur the adoption of results obtained from FTA-funded research projects by recommending and developing a systematic approach to disseminate lessons learned so that public transportation agencies are informed and able to implement promising research solutions. The goals of this initiative are to, first, identify the highest impact research to practice methods, second, develop a plan on these methods, and three, to create a new outreach program for FTE's research results. At FTE, we're interested in understanding what dissemination and research methods have the greatest impact for public transit agencies. Currently, we manage an active research portfolio of almost $200 million for over 200 projects. Research grant recipients typically partner with a public transit agency to study and test solutions. And most research projects generate compelling and useful research reports. However, our public transportation stakeholders have very little time to read reports or hunt for fact sheets. So given the demands of their time, public transit agency personnel need a streamlined way to find useful information that can improve their services. As you all know, there are many ways to communicate results, and the concepts of adult learning and universal design are very, very important. People have different preferences in how they consume information. Some are visual, some are audio, some prefer text, others prefer graphics. Some like to engage in peer-to-peer exchanges, while others would like to read a short synopsis of a compelling research result. Thus, this new initiative will help FDA tailor its outreach to practice activities for diverse stakeholders and fulfill our research mission by accelerating innovation in public transportation that is safe, meets racial and economic inclusion goals, and is resilient against climate change. It will help us share proven solutions and extrapolate the results so that any transit provider can benefit from the findings. I hope you will stay in touch with us as we roll out this new program. We have lots of ideas for how to expand outreach and to market the results of our research investments in new ways that take advantage of the digital and online world, but we need to test them out with a partner. At the end of the day, our research is only effective if it helps transit agencies serve their communities more effectively and if it ensures more equitable, accessible, clean energy, transformative, connected communities that are economically strong with transit systems that help everyone get to where they need to go, when they need to get there, reliably, quickly, safely, affordably, and accessibly. So in closing, I'd like to introduce today's 4 exciting sessions. Today's event is covering topics ranging from performance metrics used in the transit industry, transit travel trends in the COVID-19 era, and the use of data, technology, and innovations to improve transit management operations. Specifically, a group of international speakers will discuss how some increasingly important performance measures such as equity and outcomes and accessibility, that is access to destinations, accessibly accessing destinations, are addressed in the international context. We're fortunate to have speakers from Israel, Canada, and Brazil. Later, a group of researchers will discuss findings on travel trends and mode choice preference involving public transit and shared use modes. We will also hear how consultants from the private sector work with transit agencies to leverage data analytics and technology to inform decision-making and improve transit operations. Finally, a panel of local experts will discuss how transit research and practice processes have been implemented in Florida. Wow, this is just a phenomenal agenda, you all. So thank you very much and have a great symposium. Back to you all.
Thank you very much, Mary. Really appreciate your remarks to kick us off for today. So beginning in this session, we will have Jacob Yan, who will be the moderator for the session on international perspectives on equity and accessibility. So take it away, Jacob.
Thank you so much, Chad, and thanks, Mary, for your opening remarks. It was very inspirational. So the first section we have today is on access and equity. And we have 3 famous researchers in this field that we are lucky to have here today. So let me quickly introduce them to you. You can also see their bio on the UFTI website. So our first speaker is Carol Martins. He is a full professor of transportation planning at the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning, Technion Israel Institute of Technology, while he heads the Fair Transport Lab. Martins is an international expert on transport and justice. He has authored numerous publications on this topic, culminating in his book, Transport Justice, Designing Fair Transportation Systems, which has been described by colleagues as groundbreaking, a landmark, and a revolution. He is a well-known expert in this field, transport justice. So our second speaker is Stephen Faber. who is an associate professor from the University of Toronto. He is a transportation geographer and spatial analyst. His research investigates the social and economic outcomes of transportation and land use decision-making in urban areas. His current research projects focus on the distributional aspect of transit accessibility, personal mobility, and participation in the activities of daily life. He has won a large grant with a panel of international experts on this topic. And finally, we have Rafael Pereira, who is from Brazil. Rafael works as the head of data science team at the Department of Regional, Urban, and Environmental Studies at the Institute for Applied Economic Research in Brazil. His research looks broadly at how urban and transport policies shape the spatial organization of cities, human mobility patterns, as well as their impacts on social and health inequalities. Rafael is particularly interested in the equity concerns underlying impact assessment of urban and transport planning policies and their effects on inequalities in access to opportunities. So three speakers will each present some of their recent work. They will present for about 15 minutes, and we will have a little bit Q&A time at the end. So Carol, can you start the first presentation?
Thank you, Jacob, for the kind introduction. I'm honored to be here and happy to present my work to this important forum. I was also very pleased to hear Mary Leary's introduction of the ambitious goals set in California for the transport system. I don't think they're obvious. For decades, we have not been so inclusive. For decades, we have not aimed to deliver a high-quality transport system for all, I think. And it's a major change that's occurring over the past decade or so, where we realize that transport systems have to serve all. I will be presenting our work we have done over the past year, 2 years, jointly with two colleagues, Matan Singer and Aviv Cohen-Zada, and actually analyzing US metropolitan areas and the transit systems in those areas. And I will be trying to make a point that we should change our equity analysis if we really want to push for a transport system that serves all. So let me kick off. So currently, I think if we think about equity in transit, we use a range of measures. And I'm just presenting a few very briefly. So we typically do studies of satisfaction with transit, how satisfied people are with existing services. And the moment we analyze these results of such satisfaction studies by population groups, according to income, gender, race, they will also become a measurement of equity in some way. We tend to analyze coverage, so which neighborhoods are well served by transit, which are poorly served, frequencies, service in the evening, and so forth. And again, neighborhoods go together with socioeconomic differences, and so they also provide an insight in equity, presumably. Increasingly, and especially in the academic world, but also increasingly in practice, we are analyzing disparities in transit accessibility. So access to destinations, we analyze to what extent the transit system enables people to get to places, work especially, but also hospitals, education, and so on. And there are more of this kind of measures that look at the transit system itself, so public transport only. And I would say these analyses, while useful in raising awareness about equity and about who we are serving and who are we serving not or less well, I think they're also hide very much. And what they basically all do is, and I frame it a little bit without respect, I realize, so apologize, we are actually analyzing the distribution of poverty. We all know that in the US, and not only in the US, I have to admit that also in Israel, where I'm currently based, and also in Holland, where I'm originally from, if you analyze transit only, you're basically analyzing how poverty is distributed. So we don't have enough. Let's see how much everybody gets of that of which we don't have enough. And then if everybody gets a little bit of the poverty, then things are fair. But I don't think this is a proper way of analyzing, right? We wouldn't like to analyze if we had not enough food to feed everybody, if everybody gets a little bit of food at least, so that they will not die tomorrow, but only in a week. That is not a meaningful measure of equity. That's basically missing the point. And so if we want to know whether transit systems are equitable, we have to look beyond transit itself. And this is not what we are doing in research and in planning practice. What we're doing mostly is actually doing a disparity analysis. So we analyze how different groups are being served by the transit system in these various ways I just discussed. Now, disparity analysis typically distinguish between various groups by income, race, gender, geographical location, and then they analyze whether these groups receive a certain level of service, and they compare the averages across groups. So do low-income people receive the same transit service as high-income people? Do Afro-Americans receive the same service as Hispanics and as whites, and so on? And if you look at practice, we see a range of analysis being conducted. So we analyze the current situation, we analyze the situation in the future after we have made improvements in our transit system, or we only analyze the benefits of the improvements and we don't look at the total situation. So we have a range of ways of analyzing equity in a disparity analysis. Now, I think these analyses have been very, very useful, and they are still very useful. They have certainly raised interest and concern about what we are doing and who we are providing transit to. But I think disparity analyses are very problematic for two main reasons. And one reason is that they are very flexible in their focus. So if you look at practice, transit authorities, transport authorities, metropolitan planning organizations are very flexible in the analysis they're actually presenting. So they might be analyzing the future situation, they might be analyzing the incremental benefits, and they're very strategic in presenting results. So it's not systematic, but it's like finding the results that don't look too bad, that make it seem that transit is serving everybody reasonably well. And the second problem, and more problematic, I think, is a disparity analysis. They look at groups, so they compare the rich with the poor, blacks with whites, and see if these groups receive comparable service. But they ignore inherently the enormous differences within those groups. So on the average, maybe the blacks might be served as good as white people, but within those groups, there might be lots of people who are not served well at all. And an average just disappears. If some are served well and others are served poorly, the average might be fine for both groups. And so we don't really know if everybody's served well if we just compare group averages. And a third and related issue is that if we compare accessibility levels, for instance, which are very common in disparity analysis, well, we don't know whether people receive sufficient accessibility. We don't know if people actually can get to destinations. So everybody may get roughly the same level, whites and Hispanics, rich and poor, but none gets enough. We don't know because we only see whether there's a difference or not. And so the main point being, disparity analysis are an excellent way to hide inequities. They are meant to reveal them, but they can as well hide them. And to make it more clear and more explicit, disparity analysis can hide injustices. And injustices is a much stronger word than inequities, which sounds kind of gentle. It's an injustice, I would argue. And so we argue that we should move away from disparity analysis to analysis that actually take everybody into account. So we cannot use group-wide averages. We should analyze the situation of each person. That is what philosophy of justice requires. That is what Title VI requires. Each person also counts according to the Title VI formulation. And so once we do this, we have to analyze transit system based on an explicit equity principle. It's not enough to compare groups. We have to say, what do we think is equitable? What is just? And so we propose to set a sufficiency standard. a standard of sufficient accessibility to destinations. Now, currently, we don't have any debate in society about such a standard. Like we have it on income. We have a minimum income threshold, which is widely accepted and used for analysis. We don't have such a standard in transport. So we should have such a societal debate. Since we don't have it in our analysis, we used average car-based accessibility in a region as our benchmark for setting a sufficiency threshold. And then we assume that if average car-based accessibility in a region provides enough accessibility, likely because land use has organized around the car and road system. And so then we take a percentage of that average car-based accessibility and we consider that a sufficiency threshold for transit. And then we have conducted our analysis for 49 metropolitan areas using different sufficiency thresholds. And these thresholds range from 1% of car-based accessibility. So if you have access to 1 million jobs by car on average, then 1% would mean 10,000 jobs is sufficient accessibility. That would presumably enable you to get a job, to get to shops, to get to healthcare, to give you enough to actually get around. And we up to a very high standard of 50%. Our analysis focused on 49 metropolitan areas. We used a cumulative accessibility measure, meaning all jobs accessible within 30 minutes are counted. We use door-to-door travel times for transit and for car-based accessibility. And we got the data from the Accessibility Observatory of the University of Minnesota. And we assumed that transit is especially key for low-income people. So we assume that higher-income people are served well by the car system, and we're focusing on the low-income people, asking, do they get enough service? Are they served well by transit? Do they achieve this threshold of 1, 10, 20, 30, or 50%? Who does and who does not? And based on this, we can estimate how many people are served adequately and how many are served inadequately. And we get a measure of the true performance from an equity perspective of the transit system in US metropolitan areas. And we brought our data together in what we call the Accessibility Sufficiency Dashboard, which has been online now for a week. Here's a snapshot of our dashboard, and it gives you your possibility to select one of the 49 cities in the top left corner and get lots of statistics for each metropolitan area, allowing people to compare their region with other regions, allowing to compare the situation of different racial groups, allowing the to analyze the pattern of insufficient accessibility over space, and so on. Given the time, I'm only showing a few results of what our Accessibility Sufficiency Dashboard is giving. For people who want to figure it out themselves, they can go to my Fair Transport Lab website in the Technion, and I will share that later on in the chat after I'm done speaking. So one very simple but powerful statistic is how many people are facing insufficient accessibility. So how many people cannot get to many jobs being a measure of how easy you can get around. If you can get to many jobs, you can get easily around. You can also get to shops, most likely, to healthcare services, to education, to meet family and friends. Jobs are spread out over the metropolitan area, so it gives some indication of how free you are to move, how free you are to get to places. And so here we present the results for all the thresholds, and we start with the 1% threshold, and you can see that 10 million people across the 49 metropolitan areas are not served adequately. This is 6% of the population in the 49 regions and 50% of all poor people. And if we raise the sufficiency threshold gradually, we see that that number jumps to 20 million and nearly 90% of all poor people. And if we move further up to 50%, we see that virtually all poor people in US metropolitan areas are not adequately served by transit currently. They might manage, but if the circumstances change, if they lose their job, they will have difficulty to find another job because they don't get too many jobs easily. So that would be affecting 21 million people. Now we have and conducted most of our analysis for the 10% sufficiency threshold. We have some evidence that this seems to be a reasonable standard that actually does deliver people with a reasonable level of freedom to move around and get to places. So that we have conducted most of our analysis for this. Now let me just show some results.
Carl, sorry to interrupt you. 2 minutes.
2 minutes. I'm close to finishing. Thanks, Jacob. So one is we analyze shortfalls, accessibility shortfalls. How far are you below the sufficiency threshold? And just results for 2 cities, Cincinnati and Phoenix. And we see that the darker blue indicates that you're farther below the sufficiency threshold, and to be expected, the farther you're away from the CBD, the larger the shortfall. And there's only small areas that have more than 10% of average car accessibility around the CBD in Cincinnati and both Phoenix. It seems that the problem is in the periphery of these metropolitan regions. But if we take into account actually where low-income people live, we see a completely different picture. And we see what we call insufficiency hotspots. And these hotspots of accessibility insufficiency in both these regions are actually quite clustered and in many cases quite close to the central business district. So we see here in Cincinnati a big cluster north of the CBD, and in Phoenix we see it on both sides of the CBD. And so although accessibility is clearly lowest in the periphery by transit, most low-income people still live rather centralized. And so the challenge we have is really an urban and suburban, the first suburban ring challenge. It's not impossible to serve these areas with high quality public transport. It is a matter of priorities and investment. So let me wrap up. The argument here is that disparity analysis have been crucial to put equity on the agenda for transit and transport authorities, but they can hide inequity, and this may actually lead to avoidance of action. So we say we should be more explicit, set a standard, and then we can see actually that many people in metropolitan areas in the US and beyond are not adequately served. And if we do this, if we move outside our comfortable transit zone, and show how badly transit is performing compared to car, we may actually shift the debate, and we may shift the debate about transportation investment priorities. And if we don't do this, we will be distributing poverty rather than adequate access. So if you want to learn more about the philosophy behind this empirical analysis, you're invited to read my book and to visit the website with dashboard to see more about your own city. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you so much, Carl. Very proactive argument, very very thoughtful analysis. So for the audience, if you have any questions, please type in the YouTube chat so that I can read them and ask them in the end. So let's go to the second speaker, Steve. Can you start to share your screen and do your presentation?
Very pleased to be participating in this panel, and I think the presentation that I'm about to give complements what Carl has so nicely set up for us. I'm going to take a step back. Okay, it's not changing. Okay, I'm going to take a step back and really have you think about all the plethora of things that transportation planners focus on in their daily work. Thinking about the goals of public transit in particular, and thinking about what metrics we use and what metrics we plan towards when we are developing or operating our transit systems. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on each of these boxes, but I want to just kind of give you a sense that transportation planners in general are pulled in a lot of different directions and are trying to accomplish a lot of different goals all at once. But I really think, it's a shame because we've lost track of the impacts of transportation on people in our transportation planning process. And just going back to some of the more fundamental goals of the transportation system is, we are trying to enable people with the freedom to participate in the activities of daily life. That is not the only goal, the only fundamental goal, but it's one of the main fundamental purposes of a transportation system. And in many ways, this objective of enabling participation has been sidelined. I don't think it's been purposefully sidelined as much as it's inadvertently been sidelined as we shift our gaze towards achieving other sorts of mobility goals, other sorts of economic development goals, and of course, goals that help us manage the externalities associated with the transportation system, like pollution and climate change and health and things like that. And in light of all of this, I ask, do we even really know how to achieve this participation objective? Have we lost track of this? And even if we were to suggest that we know how to foster participation using our transportation system, how can we make sure that we do this in a just way or a fair way? And what this really boils down to is this whole notion of transportation equity being the fairness of the distribution of costs and benefits in the transportation system. And we've talked about accessibility being one of the ways that we measure the benefits, right? But on top of that, if we're talking about equity in the transportation system, we've got several core questions. So what are the costs that we'd like to measure? What are the benefits? What are the distributive population groups? And then very importantly, what is fair? And if we just kind of take these 4 questions and think about what Carl presented in the previous presentation, we can see that, okay, well, in that case, we didn't really talk about costs, but we certainly talked about benefits, and we talked about measuring benefits using accessibility. In terms of the distributive population groups, it was really focused based on income, which is great, but not the only distributive population group that matters in society, of course, as well. And then what is fair? A very challenging question, but one that, we could let politicians debate. As researchers, we are also very interested in presenting recommendations for what we think fair is, or what, or how we can be setting those thresholds using some research and evidence. So to me, a lot of the research that's done in this kind of transportation equity space is picking up on these 4 core dimensions. And this is extremely important right now in Canada. Transportation equity, transportation justice is a really hot topic. It was hot before the pandemic because of these global trends in growing inequality in society, especially by income levels. But on top of that, we've also got these pretty significant structural changes in the urban geography of Canadian cities. And again, this is happening very much in the US as well, and to some extent in other countries around the world. So we see the suburbanization of poverty as being one of the driving factors behind why transportation equity is coming to such a point of importance right now. And I don't have time to go into transport and social exclusion and thinking about what it means for people who don't have access to transportation, but the trends are pointing towards more and more marginalized communities living in places that are simultaneously underserved, inadequately served by good transportation options. And that really is a perfect storm for kind of the entrenchment of downward cycles, right? Of people not being able to work their way out of poverty because of these structural disadvantages that are faced by the inadequacies in the supply of transportation options to them. If you look at the Toronto case study, this is a map very similar to the ones Carl was presenting. Here we've got a map of access to jobs, access to destinations, and the black dots represent where people are living with incomes below the poverty line. And in a city like the Greater Toronto Area right now, we have about half of the low-income population living in these dark purples and lighter purple areas, so fairly well-served areas by public transportation. And we have a full half of the low-income population living in the whites and the beiges out here as well. So we do see in Toronto this kind of, like I said, this perfect storm of, hey, just as many low-income people living in really inadequately served places than adequately served. And this has a serious impact. And part of my work has been trying to uncover what effect does living in those conditions have on a household or on a person. One of the ways that we do that is we try to see whether or not these this simultaneously like being marginalized by say living in poverty as well as living in underserved communities by transit. For us, that we see evidence that this is resulting in the suppression of out-of-home activity participation levels. So based on travel surveys, we find that people who are low income and living in underserved neighborhoods are participating in fewer activities per day. And if you look at kind of all of these low income households living in the urban core where we have relatively higher levels of transportation service being provided, we don't see the emergence of these deep red clusters of activity participation deserts. Okay, so clearly it's both being it's both living with a low income as well as being underserved that largely is resulting in this activity participation suppression. And if we plot all of this using graphs, or if we conduct our regression analyses, which we've done plenty of, we do find that accessibility seems to equalize the opportunity, not just the opportunity to participate, but the revealed participation levels between different socioeconomic groups. And I'm rushing through, I don't have too much time in this one presentation, but clearly we see that on this fringe, on the edge of the city where transit's not really serving any purpose at all, there's a huge gap between households with cars and households without cars in people's ability to participate in daily activities. And if you think that the average person is participating in one out-of-home activity per day or 1.25, this gap of 0.75 activities per day is a huge degree of deprivation in people's participation rates in daily activities. And of course, that gap between carless and car households really tends to dissipate as the neighborhoods are served with higher and better levels of opportunity to reach activity destinations. That's both transit, you're right, but as well as urban form and density and land use side of the equation as well. So in response to this research that we've been conducting at the University of Toronto that helps support more equitable transportation planning, I'm very proud to share with you the news that we've been funded to develop a very large research partnership called Mobilizing Justice. And this is a screenshot of one of Mobilizing Justice's meetings. Just bear with me as I'm trying to bring up my notes because I wanted to hit a couple of points here, and I'm having trouble with my computer and the system. Okay, good. This is a multidisciplinary and multi-sector partnership, and we're really creating a forum for figuring out what kind of structural changes are needed in the transportation planning system, what research can be developed, what kind of program of research can we develop to help support that structural change, and then also identifying clear pathways of knowledge mobilization in order to move our research findings into practice, both at the government level, with private practitioners, as well as with community groups in order to support what they are themselves already advocating for. So I want to briefly describe the main research program that we've developed for mobilizing justice. The first thing is that we've identified a major gap in data related to people's transportation experiences across the country. We have very good large sample household travel surveys that tell us a lot about the day in the life of an individual, very little else about who that individual is, what barriers they might have to using the transportation system, whether or not they feel like these barriers are getting in the way of enabling their activity, participation, and well-being. So we will be conducting a very large sample national survey of transportation poverty that will help us understand the situation of marginalized communities in Canada with respect to transportation provision in a way that our census products and our typical kind of modeling-oriented transportation travel surveys, trip surveys, just can't do. The second main activity is that we will be conducting research that helps us develop data-driven equity standards. So just like Carl introduced you to the concept of a sufficiency standard, we're very interested in understanding what level of sufficiency should we be setting, and how do those different thresholds relate to observable differences in outcomes for marginalized communities. So yes, we can let the politicians set that level, but as the research community and as the public service and the practitioner community, it's up to us to be providing the right evidence to decision makers so that they can set those thresholds in a reasonable way. And for us, that evidence stems from trying to understand how marginalized communities, how their outcomes differ based on their perceived or realized levels of accessibility or ability to participate in daily activities. So this is a main thrust of our second, the second main thrust of our project. And the third is really trying to tackle and reshape the conversation around the use of mobility technologies and innovative, new mobility technologies. And we are very kind of grown very wary of new technologies being foisted into the municipal sphere without much consideration of whether or not those technologies are going to actually solve any problems that we have in the transportation system. And for us, the problem that we're focusing on is the problem of inaccessibility, the problem of transportation barriers. And therefore, we really want to guide some technology pilots directly towards the question of whether or not these technologies can be used to solve transportation poverty issues in Canadian cities. So we're curating a set of about 10 pilots over the next 5 years that are specifically aimed at exploring the use of new technologies within marginalized communities to see how they might alleviate transport poverty. So again, this sounds like a lot. It is a lot. This is a 5-year project. It's just for scale, it's several $1 million, and we've got a team of 30 academics and 30 government, industry, and community partners collaborating with us on the initiative. So this isn't Steve Farber's work. Of course, this is building upon the ideas and many working groups within our project who are going to be pushing these different activities forward. The other kind of thing, in addition to this, is we've developed 3 cross-cutting themes that intersect with all of the activities that I just described on the previous slide. So the first is this.
Steve, sorry, I was too engaged listening to you. I forgot to remind you of time. Can you try to wrap up in 1 minute?
Yes, I think
15 minutes.
This is my last slide. So we've got prioritizing populations. So looking at really defining those distributive groups within a Canadian context. Of course, we've got income, and we've got race, we've got immigration, we've got indigenous populations. We have a lot of, with so much of the research stemming from the United States and Title VI definitions and so on, and EJ definitions, Canadians have been very lazy to adopt those definitions without really stopping to think, what do we really need within an urban Canadian context? And there are some differences. We've got expertise across different transportation modes who are plugging into pilots, plugging into our survey, plugging into setting standards for service provision for different modes. And then we have a big group working on kind of equity within the planning process, trying to understand what are marginalized communities already advocating for. How can we make planning practices more equitable? So not just those metrics of equity, but also the communication, the listening, the reciprocity, and so on. One of the things that I'm really excited about is actually going into the professional barriers to achieving equity goals. What are planners? Many of you are planners working in practice. How are you rewarded in your jobs? And similarly, how would you be penalized if you needed to spend more money and much more time than called for in order to do things in a more equitable way? And trying to unpack those barriers that that professionals actually face in the workplace that get in the way of trying to achieve some of these equity goals. So, sorry, I didn't realize my slide wasn't advancing. So, yeah, with that, I just wanted to share with you this exciting initiative, that we really hope to be in conversation with practitioners, yes, across Canada, but we really think what we're doing mirrors very much what a lot of people are up to in the US and in Europe and in Brazil and other places, and we hope to find ways to expand our network and really work together to share these best practices and findings and achieve those truly structural changes that are needed in order to accomplish our equity goals. So thanks very much, and looking forward to discussing more.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Very comprehensive and on-the-ground work. So our last speaker is Rafael. Rafael, can you start to get prepared? Chad, I think we have we can extend for like 5 minutes, right? So that Raf at least can have 15 minutes for his presentation.
Okay, I can try to get a shorter presentation if you want. So very, very honored to be here. It's very good to share the floor, so to speak, with Karel and Steve. For all of us who have been working with transportation equity and accessibility, their work has always been very inspirational and thought-provoking. And I'm speaking today from a position as a researcher at the Institute for Applied Economic Research at IPEA. So we are a research institution based in the Brazilian federal government, which is kind of a privileged position because all of the research that we do is ultimately aimed at improving and influencing policy decision-making in Brazil and hopefully elsewhere as well. And I'll be talking about some of the projects that we've been doing in Brazil, especially one major project that we've been collaborating with so many different people about the topic of accessibility and equity. And just as a starting point, it's important to recognize, as Steve and Karel have already said, that transportation equity is just one part of a broader concern with transport justice. So I have a chapter published recently with Alex Garner in the International Encyclopedia of Transportation, where we summarize in very few pages what has been the major ideas and debates about transportation justice that have been circling around over the past few years. So it builds a lot on the work of Steve, Karel, and ourselves, and it basically shows or summarizes the idea that transport justice has three main pillars. So for your transportation policy to be considered just, it has to abide to values of democracy, diversity, and equity. And democracy and diversity in the sense that your transportation policy needs to have procedural justice in terms of being fair to the political and the decision-making process, get people involved and hear people in the decision-making process. But it also means that the policy needs to recognize group-based differences, identities, needs, and the fact that so many different groups, minority groups, they face imbalanced power relationships. And when we talk about what are the minimum accessibility levels that we want to provide, what are the different needs that these different groups face. And ultimately, the third pillar of a transportation justice agenda is really to think about transportation equity or distributive justice, which, as Steve and Karel have already said, it's mostly about how the institutions that we put in place, how the policies, the laws, and the transportation interventions that we do, how they shape the distributions of benefits and burdens. And as we've been talking about burdens, about transport externalities, traffic fatalities, transport pollution, and the core topic of the session today is really to talk about the accessibility benefit, as accessibility is, by definition, one of the most important benefits that we get out of a functioning transport system. So we have kind of a gap in this topic in Brazil, contrary to North America and Europe. The topic of transportation equity and accessibility is not so boiling in Brazil, so to speak. So we are trying to heat up this discussion with this project called the Access to Opportunities Project. And the aim of the project is really threefold. To estimate annually access to employment, healthcare, and education services by transport mode at a high spatial resolution for all of Brazil's largest urban areas. And we want to put all of this data and the results publicly available. So all the methods as well are also publicly available. And everyone going on our website that you can see on top of the screen, you can visualize these results, download the data, and browse some interactive maps to check the results of our neighborhood, for example. Ultimately, what we want to achieve with this project is to inform policy and planning, so that the data that we produce is being used and analyzed by academics, researchers, policymakers, local authorities, and NGOs, and so to speak. So we can think about accessibility in so many different ways. Right now, we are measuring accessibility with many different indicators. These are just two examples that show you the proportion of jobs that are accessible by public transport in the city of São Paulo, here in the map on the left. And on the map on the right, you see the time that takes you to travel from your home to the closest hospital of high complexity. This is just one example with two very simple accessibility measures, but we are doing this at a very large scale in a much more complex way, because we're doing these estimates for all of the 20 largest cities in Brazil every single year by transport mode, for walking, cycling, public transport, and now by cars. And we're also looking not only at employment, but at 3 types of schools and 3 types of healthcare services. All of the work that we do, if you think about the possible combination of all indicators and analysis by income groups, by population age, by race and ethnic and minority groups, the amount of possibilities that you can get out of the analysis is really humongous. That's why we are putting all of this data publicly available, because we want to share the possibility that others might be able to analyze and use the data in their own work as well. One thing that I find that could possibly be of interest to an audience in the United States is how you're doing all of this. Because for a major project like this, and the projects that we saw with Karel and Steve, we're always using lots of different types of data sets, from satellite imagery data to population surveys, GTFS data, and geolocated data of households, schools, healthcare facilities, and so on. And we combine all of this to generate accessibility estimates. And there are many different softwares where you could use to do this. Alongside the project, we developed a computational package named R5R, which stands for Rapid Realistic Routing with R5 and R. So I believe many of you will be familiar with OpenTripPlanner, which is an open source routing engine that's used for a lot of the accessibility analysis that we see nowadays. OpenTripPlanner is developed by Conveyo. And R5R is not different. Actually, R5R is also developed by Conveo, but it's kind of a next generation, so to speak, of OTP. The main benefit of R5R is that you can do exactly all the same things that you would do in OTP, but you can do it for free within R in much, much faster rate, and I mean orders of magnitude faster. So literally with just 2 lines of code, you can calculate accessibility for an entire country or an entire region in just a matter of a couple minutes. With the data that we produce, we can do so many different types of analysis. Just so you have an idea, we have recently used some of the data to analyze geographic and social inequalities in access to COVID-19 healthcare in Brazil. And we were able to find that in all of those 20 cities in Brazil, low-income communities and Black communities, they have much lower access to healthcare services, to hospitals with ICU beds and mechanical ventilators. Another common application that we have been doing with this kind of data is really trying to anticipate what are the future accessibility and equity impacts of transportation interventions, also land use interventions and housing policies and so on. Very simple and quick example here. This is the city of Fortaleza in Brazil. It's a city which has approximately 3 million people. They are currently building a subway expansion, which would be this red line right here, crossing the city center of Fortaleza, where you can see this is the place where you have not only the city center with a lot of jobs, but it's also crossing the place, a region of the city with lots of population of high income and high density. So actually they are building a subway line in the area with the highest income population, with the highest concentration of jobs, where you naturally have the highest level of access to opportunities. But on top of that, they're also doing a major reconfiguration of bus lines, meaning they're downgrading the system. Surprisingly, they're cutting back a lot of the services, reducing frequencies, cutting lines, and so on and so forth. So one of the analysis that we're doing is trying to anticipate, okay, once this subway line is finished, once this new accessibility plan is implemented, what will be the impact of the accessibility impact, and who will benefit from those interventions? And what we see here is that if they follow through with the interventions they're planning, you might get some accessibility gains in a few parts of the city, but you have a lot of accessibility losses in most of the region because of those service cuts. In an alternative scenario where we ignore the reconfiguration of the bus lines and we only consider the subway expansion, kind of like counterfactual scenario, this is the kind of impact that we would expect. As I said, the subway is being constructed in a region with high accessibility, so most of the gains are actually distributed a little bit further away. And from an income level, this is what we see. So basically, we're saying that accessibility is going for all of the income groups. So each box plot is the distribution of how the accessibility impact will be distributed among the poorest population to the wealthiest population. And we see that pretty much for every income bracket, accessibility will be negatively impacted for most of the city, but not all of the city. And in the alternative scenario, you see that pretty much everyone will gain accessibility as expected, but most of the gains will be concentrated in middle income and high income groups. This is just one example of one of the projects that we have been doing on top of the Access to Opportunities project data. Moving forward, we will now be incorporating data with historical GPS speed of private vehicles. We are negotiating with partners to expand this project to cover not only the largest Brazilian cities, but the largest cities in Latin America. We've been doing some other impact assessments of transport interventions, housing policies. Ultimately, similarly to what Steve was saying, what really boils down at the end of the day is to what extent these accessibility levels that people have influence their social, economic, and health outcomes. That's what really matters at the end of the day. That's something that we'll be trying to do next. And we have now started a project collaboration with Uber to analyze both considering travel times, but also monetary costs. When we think of accessibility in a more complete or full perspective, whether Uber services are competing or playing as a complementary role with public transport services. So this is something that it's not that I could do by myself. We're talking about so many different cities, so many different data sets and analysis, and we have a small team collaborating with us. I'm very thankful to them. I realize that we are very short in time. I would like to say some other stuff, but we can leave it later for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Raphael. I've been a consumer of your package R5R. It's a great package that I suggest everybody to use for accessibility analysis. So we are actually 2 minutes over our allocated time, but because our next section starts 1:15, and we really have a great international speakers here. They are in Brazil, Israel, and Canada, not from the US. So it's very it's a treasure for us to have them all be here. So we have one important question from the audience. I hope that the speakers can quickly address. Laura Paget Seekins asked, the current transportation inequalities didn't just happen by chance. They are the result of deliberate policy decisions to benefit some at the expense of others. So for the speakers, how do you take into account an analysis of power in translating research into achieving more equitable transportation systems? And I want to add a little my own question to that. Name one thing from your research that the transit agencies or transportation decision makers can do to improve transportation equity. So 2 questions.
Who wants to start? Karel?
Raphael, how do you take into account power? I think by realizing that how we make transport policy decisions now is an outcome of a struggle. And so by empowering people who promote more equitable transport systems by providing data, by suggesting alternative ways of analyzing the transport system, and so giving professionals that do want to build inclusive transport system the tools to do so, we can maybe overcome those groups who will push for the same systems as have been built over the past decades. So knowledge cannot replace power. Knowledge can assist in changing the power balance by revealing injustices, hoping that it will garner public support, hoping that good willing transport professionals will take up the new tools that are being developed by Raphael, by Steve, by us, and by many others, and use them in their analysis. This is a way to change transport planning. I think, like Steve also suggested, that the current system is not certainly not only the result of deliberate efforts to design a system that only serves some people. I think it is partly the result of transport professionals doing their job and not realizing the implications for people not being served.
Jacob, if I may jump into the question there, I think it's a fantastic question, because when we look at the literature, most of the analysis that we look at are static analysis. What are the inequalities today or 5 years ago? We rarely get the chance of having a look at the movie or the motion picture of how things are changing over time. And I think that's where power actually comes into play. It's in the planning process. It's in the difference in terms of who has access to designing transportation projects, designing transportation interventions, who gets the funding to implement their ideas. When I'm showing a subway expansion in the city of Fortaleza, where the subway is being built exactly in the wealthiest region of the city, in the city center, it makes you wonder, why building a subway in that specific place and not in a different place, or just improving the subway lines that already exist but are very poor quality. And I think that's when power comes into the discussion. It's not so much about the accessibility inequalities that we see, but it's about the shaping force that it's the force that shaped those inequalities to come about in how they are. And I think in that sense, this quantitative accessibility analysis, they're very, very important, but they speak very little to this power imbalances in the transportation planning process, which I think is very important.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And do you have anything that you would recommend the policymakers to do to improve transportation equity? The top thing on your mind? We do have some policymakers in this room and in the audience. They can make this change. What you want them to do?
Well, the first thing is we have to take into account that the North American context is very different from the Brazilian context. So if you can imagine that, I'm not entirely sure about what is the full picture in the United States, but in Brazil, if you can imagine, when you have a transportation project like that subway expansion or a housing policy or whatever transportation intervention that you can think of, transport agencies, sometimes they do a cost benefit analysis, but they never, ever consider accessibility impacts. And I mean it. And I think from a transportation equity point of view, the least you would expect is to anticipate what will be the likely accessibility impacts, who will benefit from those impacts, and who will bear the cost of those interventions. And this might sound really, really obvious when we're here talking in theory, but in practice, this is a major gap, not only in Brazil, but also I think in Latin America in general, in most of Asia and in African countries as well.
Thank you. Carl, do you want to say something quickly?
It is not an easy thing to do, but I think we heard Mary Leary, and if you hear the language, then basically we made the first right step. We now say we want to build inclusive transport systems. So let us define more precisely what that is, and then analyze whether we deliver and who's already included, and so doesn't need more service. There's no reason for complaint, and who's not included and does deserve more service. So take the radical step of taking our own goals seriously and do not continue with the traditional way of analyzing the transport system, seeing where congestion is, thinking congestion is our major problem. It's not our major problem. All people in congestion, virtually all, arrive at their destinations within a reasonable time, against reasonable cost, and with high convenience. Although it's annoying to be in congestion, I wouldn't deny that. But many people struggle much more to get to their destinations. And we really have to fundamentally change the discourse around transport, and it will be very, very difficult. But I think transport professionals have the duty to take the role of transport in society seriously, which is to provide everyone with access to destinations. And it means radical change of what people are doing now. Nothing less and nothing more.
You want to say something?
I just want, given this great conversation, I just want to say I think the key is making sure that the people who are impacted by the decisions are at the planning table, and that it's, you know, the diverse stakeholder community. It's really, really important.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you both for offering these thoughtful answers to the two hard questions at the end. And your presentations are fantastic. I'm really glad that we made this happen. And thank you again, Mary, for the opening remarks. We have to end this section here because the next section on Florida transit innovations will happen in 5 minutes, actually 4 minutes. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for your attention for the YouTube audience. And we will see you in 4 minutes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We had hoped to be in Florida for this whole symposium. That couldn't happen, but we're going to act like we're in Florida. And we've pulled together a number of persons involved in the Florida public transportation community to talk to us in their virtual format. The participants are Ruth Steiner from the University of Florida, a professor at the university, my good friend Carlos Cruz Casas from Miami-Dade County, the Department of Public Works, where their transit system is a part of. Jesus Gomez from Gainesville Regional Transit. Jesus, great to be with you. And Pruthi Manjunaha from UFTA I Street, which we'll talk a little more about because I want to learn more about that myself, Pruthi. But you know, we have, and by the way, I'm Art Gazzetti. I'm the long-serving Vice President for Policy at the American Public Transportation Association, APTA. We're a proud co-sponsor of this event. My whole long career has been in public transportation. I worked previously for the Port Authority of Allegheny County, the transit system in Pittsburgh, and also New Jersey Transit, the statewide transit authority in New Jersey. We have some pre-identified themes that we're going to talk about here, but we're going to have a high energy conversation and we'll see where it goes. Largely about Florida, but many of the discussion points can be inferred across the country. And we do welcome, as in all the sessions, audience participation. Please enter your comments in the chat room. So let me ask a question that we can go around the horn. And maybe Carlos, we'll start with you, and then we will proceed. Actually, let me say this. Why don't we go in the order that I introduced you? We'll start with Ruth, and then Carlos, Jesus, and Pruthvi. But I'd like your perspectives. It's sort of a little bit of a broad opening question about Florida. Tell us about Florida. Some overarching themes you think might be informative to the audience. How is Florida different than other states? Is it largely the same in your view? Just sort of really, we consider this a wide open question to just make a general statement on the state of affairs in Florida and what might be useful for attendees to hear and understand. Ruth, please.
So the way that I think about this, and I'm going to start by indicating that I moved from San Francisco Bay Area to North Florida in 1994. And in my dissertation, I did research on that was looking at walking in neighborhoods in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I wanted to think about replicating that. And one of my selection criteria in my dissertation research was neighborhoods that had at least 6 or more dwelling units per acre, or about 15, which was considered for half-hour, maybe 20-minute transit service. And what I found, and the first project I got in Florida was a little bit of funding to have a student look at this. And much to my surprise, there were very few places in Florida. A few neighborhoods in Tampa, a few neighborhoods in Orlando, a few in Jacksonville, and many, many more in South Florida. But when you looked at the density, that basic density criteria, which we often think about related to transit, the entire state of Florida had fewer census tracts than the San Francisco Bay Area had that reached that low threshold. Now, I will grant you that Florida, and that sort of relates to the challenge for transit, not only in Florida, but much of the Southeast, which is our density of development is often quite low, which means that we really have to think in different ways about transit. At the same time, the population of the state has been growing by about 3 million a decade, which means that we have increasing densification and many cities. I mentioned the 4 major urban areas where transit solutions are increasingly looked to because we've worked through all of the other ways to reduce congestion, and we haven't found ways to move people efficiently and effectively in the development context in which we live. One other transit solution that I've seen used more frequently in Florida is the idea of a downtown circulator. There's the automated people mover both in Miami and Jacksonville, and Tampa and Orlando. Tampa has a streetcar and Orlando has downtown bus-based, BRT-based downtown circulator. So it's worth mentioning those are solutions that I think are somewhat unique in the Florida context.
Ruth, very well stated. There's some nice takeaways there for sure. Carlos, let's move to you.
Yeah, that's hard to follow, Art. You know, how to follow, it's hard to follow her here. Thank you for having me here. I closed my blinds because it's really sunny here in Florida. I moved from Puerto Rico to North Florida to go to UF, do a master's degree there. And I can tell you, I've driven pretty much through the entire state of Florida, just kind of for fun and just kind of for work. One of the things I can tell you is, in addition to what Ms. Tyner has mentioned, is it's very expansive. You know, even Miami-Dade County, as one of 67 counties in the state, is bigger than some states. So put it into perspective, the size of Florida. But I'll tell you this: whether it's on bicycles or pedestrians or transit or autonomous vehicles, we pretty much have all the use cases needed, right? Other than snow and slopes, I want to say that Florida has it all, right? From heavy intensity, from beaches, from lakes and rivers and farms. There's a winery in Southeast Florida. I just tell you that there's a winery there. So there's a lot of that to consider, a lot of different use cases. Like you mentioned, it basically allows us to be, or basically require of us to be more creative and to make sure that we use all the different tools in the toolkit to make sure that we provide mobility for heavy dense areas as well as farm areas as well as more sprawl area. So it's a challenge on us, but at the same time, it's an invitation for the great minds to help us kind of join together into moving forward. And on that note, one of the things I will mention is Florida as a state has embraced this idea about innovation, right? Not necessarily means technology, it means about the way we address our problems. And I think it's really interesting to start seeing how we have, from the beginning, champion, if you will, the public-private partnership in great infrastructure projects like the tunnels and the 595s and some of the other interstates. Now it's interesting to start thinking about all that we have learned and apply it to transit and apply it to other mobility solutions. And I think that is something to tell a lot about Florida is really hungry for innovation, really welcoming that participation from around the world and local here to make sure that we help move people more efficiently.
Thank you, Carlos. More good points. And Jesus, we'll jump right to you.
Yes, we see the support for transit growing in Florida. You know, compared to other states, we were not, and a few years ago, we were not that transit oriented. So you see those changes coming in with the density and population increasing here. We in demographics, you know, people always come to retire in Florida. So all these, we're addressing those mobility needs. One of the things I see also in other states that we see that on a yearly basis, the emergency operations. We have a lot of experience on transit operations and emergency situations. So, you know, we have storms every year. So we deal with that, I think very efficiently statewide. That'll be the top three, changes that we've seen.
Thank you, Jesus. Prithvi.
So I moved in from India like close to a decade ago to do my PhD in Florida, and I've pretty much been here the whole time. So it was pretty shocking for me to see the lack of public transit options, and and as Dr. Steiner mentioned, all the density related reasons. But the couple of things I would like to mention that I've seen grow is the first one is the commuter rail concept. I think we have like 3 different commuter rail systems which are running in Florida right now: the Brightline, Sunrail, Tri-Rail. So that is something I believe is gaining traction. And the second thing, I work at iStreet, and from a autonomous perspective, Florida is very autonomous friendly, and the concept of autonomous shuttle is also gaining traction. In fact, Beep, which started in Orlando, is like kind of nationwide right now, and we have an autonomous shuttle, here in Gainesville, Florida, and Jesus can probably talk more on that. And we're innovation. Jesus's team recently launched an experimental, fareless system for seniors and minors. So there are a lot of things happening on multiple fronts. and it's definitely much more exciting time to be in Florida in terms of
Well,
transit.
interesting. You all offered different perspectives. And one thing I don't think I heard that maybe I'm a little surprised by, I'd like to say perhaps others around the country might have the same thought is, you know, with all the extreme weather, with extreme heat in some parts of the country, with storm surge in other parts of the country have floods, other parts of the country have earthquakes. But you would think Florida would have a particular, maybe unique element of resiliency required, but maybe I'm wrong on that. I noticed the latest hurricanes have seemed to hit Louisiana, ouch, and missed Florida. But is resiliency in your infrastructure and the way you plan and design projects, is that a central theme, or would you say no, it's just the same here as anywhere else? Carlos, can we start with you?
Yeah, of course. We are ground zero for all these things that happen, right? Not only we're the first in line when hurricanes come through, but at the same time, our sea level, the water table is really low in here. So we do consider, of course, resiliency and sustainability from a major point of view, and we'd love to expand on that conversation later on. But I can tell you, it is embedded in the sense that we're hardening our infrastructure, right? It is embedded in the sense that when we're promoting transit and promoting bicycles and pedestrian activity, we take into consideration not only trying to slow down the advancements on the sea level rise and global warming, all the things that are really happening, but at the same time, extreme heat is something that is happening here in our community, and our mayor have really been a champion in all this, an innovator that he just recently hired the first chief heat officer, right? Someone that is dedicated solely to make sure that we figure out ways to navigate around the heat and make sure that we have the infrastructure. And I'm not talking only about wearing guayaberas and and shorts and all the things out there to make sure that you can feel more comfortable. There's about the infrastructure that we're doing. We're adding a lot of shelters, a lot of infrastructure to make sure that transit users have at least some sort of protection over the elements. So it is the first line in pretty much everything that we do is considering resiliency and the sustainability.
Anyone else on that point? Okay, I'm going to ask maybe a round of individual questions, and then we'll
Art,
go
I
back.
think Dr. Steiner wanted to speak, and she
Yeah,
was
I did have a response. I think one
Please.
difference, I would say that to some extent, I think there's a greater level of decentralization in the state of Florida. The state is not necessarily taking a strong role in the resiliency discussions, but for instance, in the Miami-Dade metro region, much more so than any other region in the state, there is a very strong regional compacts that are voluntary cooperation between various levels of governance on the resiliency question. There's burgeoning efforts in the Orlando and Tampa metro regions also.
Thank you, Dr. Steiner. I'm going to ask a few individual questions, and then we'll go back to more collective themes. But Dr. Steiner, I would like to ask you about, one of the things that came up in our preview here is this concept of an organic city. And I'll just leave it at that. Tell us about the concept of an organic city and how it applies to the broader conversation we're having.
So the concept of an organic city there's multiple people who talk about it in different ways, but the way that I think about it is, and the way that it's probably being used here, is that in planning, we often, as planners, we often think, and even as engineers, we try to predict the future and we try to put together plans based on assumptions about how people are going to respond in consistent with the kinds of things kind of programs we develop. But for instance, we don't necessarily, if we introduce a new innovative transit system, we really can only go so far in predicting how people are going to respond to it and how they're going to use it, and even whether they're going to use it for the places we expect them to go. And I would argue that that's a real challenge in transit planning, in the sense that while we can look at it, as soon as you introduce new service, you don't necessarily know until you introduce it. A lot of people say, I'm going to use that service. And then you get to who's actually going to use it, and are the people who said they were going to use it the ones that actually use it. So as a simple example, I've just completed a study funded by the Florida Department of Transportation on a microtransit system that's been piloted in Gainesville for the last 3 years. And there's lots of questions that were raised with this study. It was initially set up to connect to downtown transfer station. And after a very brief period of time, they went to a larger number of destinations. This is a relatively low density, low income neighborhood that has infrequent transit service. So we're looking at and trying to understand how the transit service, how did people learn about the transit service? Because the microtransit, as one former county commissioner said, who wouldn't want to have their own personal driver? You just call and get a ride. And it's much more convenient than transit service. But it does raise questions on how, in an environment, how much risk and how can you develop experiments that allow you to understand how people are going to respond when, in fact, response to new innovations in transit can take a long time to develop.
Thank you, Dr. Steiner. And speaking of Gainesville, Jesus, we'll hop to you now. You have a Gainesville, a mid-sized city, say, but a large university there. How does that change the dynamic of a transit operator? Historically, that's good. I mean, that tends to contribute to higher ridership, but I'd like you to comment on that. Perhaps the dynamic is different, or perhaps not. Also, if I could weave in another question there too, and I'm glad to enter this question into the conversation. In my long career, it's been a big issue, and the cost of paratransit. And is the trend still going the opposite way of the way we want it, or do you see opportunities to to control the cost of that? It's a very important part of what we do, right? We have to do it, and for good reasons. But I just raised that cost issue. So both of those questions, if I could weave together.
Yeah, on Gainesville, we're in a unique situation. We're a university town, and the transit service is really a part of the Department of Transportation Mobility. So we have close access to the traffic engineering department and the transportation planning department. So we work really well together. So, and being a university town, the University of Florida and the Santa Fe College are the main, partners, with DOT. A few years ago, we started with a prepaid service, about 20 years ago. And it's been growing since then. In 1998, we started with a pilot, and it grows from, we have 1.7 million passengers in 1998 to, in 2015, we have almost 10 million passengers. So the funding increased, through all these years as a part of the transportation fee that we assess to the students. So it's been very successful to having a partner like UF and Santa Fe. So 80% of our ride trips are coming from UF and Santa Fe. So it's growing. In terms of ADA paratransit, what we did, if you're using the fixed route, you ride that for free. And it's been stable through the years. We contract those services out with the AV transportation, and the cost is increasing, but it's not increasing like other transit agencies in Florida that you see an increase of 20-25% on their budgets on paratransit. Ours is being more a 5% increase every year. But you see, maybe Sarasota or West Palm Beach, you see 20-25% increases. But the way we used to control that is offer free service on the paratransit, and it's working really well. We have a lot of ADA eligible passengers using the fixed route. And with the convenience that we have a lot of frequent service, because the university is adding, funding to increase service on the student-oriented, areas.
All right, thank you, Jesus. Prithvi, I'd like to ask you, one of the themes that came out in our preliminary conversations was iStreet, and tell us a little bit more. Of course, you're a manager of iStreet.
Mhm.
Tell us a little more about that program and how it relates to Florida Transit.
Okay, yeah. iStreet is basically partnership between City of Gainesville, Florida Department of Transportation, and University of Florida's Transportation Institute. The acronym itself kind of tells what we do. Like iStreet stands for implementing solutions from transportation research and evaluating emerging technologies. So nowadays, most of the emerging technologies we are evaluating somehow are related to connected and autonomous world. So that's where I come in from. But we do a lot of work related to transit. Like I can give you several examples. I just mentioned the autonomous shuttles and the work we're doing there. We also recently concluded a project where Professor Y.K. Yoon from UF, he studied how to track usage of bike racks on the transit buses. And we did another transit related study where we looked at the advanced driver assistance system. So we had a Mobileye unit installed on the RTS buses, and we studied how useful they are in terms of giving safety messages to the transit drivers. So we are while iStreet itself is more focused on emerging technologies, we are dabbling in the world of transit, and we are doing more projects. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. And Carlos, my question for you, of course, I know of the many innovations you're doing there, and I think you're among the national leaders in innovation in Miami-Dade. We could talk about your partnerships on on-demand service, or we could talk about your innovative rewards program. I want to ask you about the City of Tomorrow Challenge, and tell us a little bit more about that and its goals.
Yeah, thank you. So the City of Tomorrow Challenge was an effort that we did with Ford, the City of One Team, the mobility side, a couple of years ago, and it was a challenge that had both sides. One was for the general public about what should we look when we plan for the city in a community that we want to live in, right? That's the most important about smart cities in future is really this place that our community wants to live in. And the other part of the challenge was challenging our private sector partners to help us understand how we can transform the way we do transportation planning. To Ms. Steiner's point earlier on, we need to really understand that the public sentiments towards mobility solutions in order to make sure that we plan the right thing. On that note, we were able to identify that the City of Tomorrow is part tech-based solutions. Of course, we see all these really things that can really help us be more efficient and seamless and bring some equity into the conversation in terms of mobility. But at the same time, is community-led. The public sentiments has a big role on it. Right now, after that effort, we continue to phase 2, if you will, the City of Tomorrow Challenge, as we now have joined an effort from the Knight Foundation and the City of San Jose, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and us, where we're now running a pilot project where we are using autonomous deliveries, basically delivery bots, to really understand the customer and the feedback and the impact to the community on these autonomous vehicles out there. And shortly after, I'm expecting to start seeing the same type of approach towards autonomous mobility solutions. So and through this effort, and one of the things that we're doing is allowing for technology innovation to happen in our community. But the most important thing, and I think this is at least a game changer for us, is that we have created what we call a community liaison program. We're hiring people from the community to be part of the conversation from the beginning, right? So it is a program that is a twofold. We allow them, basically, we bring them into as an extension of our staff to have conversation. And there's nobody better to have a conversation in their community than someone that lives there and very active there, right? And at the same time, they can help us get information back. We're trying to create this program the way we move into introducing new technologies, get them exposed, get the feedback, and see how that can be expressed elsewhere. For example, like I mentioned, Miami-Dade County is so big. We have autonomous vehicles running. Ford has announced it's going to have a partnership with Lyft later this year. But it's not going to be entire county. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is we're going to bring people from Miami Gardens, from Homestead and other places in Miami-Dade County to experience it. And then we're going to sit down and say, if this was going to the community, how you see it happen, right? So really into trying to make sure that we leverage the technology, but not for technology's sake. It has to be something that our community needs. And the only way that we can do that is by asking them directly, because not everyone in Miami-Dade County experiences the county the same. And we're trying to make sure that we don't introduce biases in the decision-making process, and we do it with the community and for the community. So I'm thrilled about that. There's more to come on that particular effort from the Knight Foundation. We have the University of Oregon and a couple other really kind of following through and helping us kind of measure the impacts and the benefits. So I'm expecting some follow-ups on that later on this year and at the beginning of the next year.
If I could ask, the community involvement process you've just described, do you target people you want to bring in this program? I mean, is it communities that have been underserved? Is it communities that have not normally participated in public involvement? Is it the most often ridership-based markets? How do you figure that out?
So yeah, we selected 10 areas in Miami-Dade County, again, small areas, and it's trying to make sure that we are diverse and inclusive, right? So we looked at all these metrics, and the team from City 1 and 4 have a lot of data driven solutions that can help us really understand the characteristics of a neighborhood and try to make sure that we map it efficiently using that, and then we go out. However, we partner, I'm not going to tell you that we know it all, right? We partner with our local nonprofit organizations called the Urban Health Partners, and this is what they do best. They hire people in the community to be participant in decision making. That's what they do best. So we partner with them. We identify the areas, and they go on and target. Right? They want to make sure there's a hiring process. Right? It is yes, you live there. However, are you active in your community? Right? What are the things that you do? There's a really robust hiring process, and I think it's really special the way that they do it. And that to me, it is particular of interest because it can help transit planning, engineering planning, and all the different the cities understand that there is talented people in the community that can help us do better decision making if we go out there and open our doors.
Thank you all. The discussions we've had of technology, of innovation, of all the things we've talked about, fit with the theme of this overall symposium, which is research to practice, how to take ideas that are coming out of innovative places like Florida, coming out of universities, and put them to work to serve our passengers, to serve our communities, to make our transit systems more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like to probe a little deeper on that question. What are some of the Florida-grown solutions, perhaps some of the ideas that are still, nascent, that are still there, but need to be tested, deployed? A wide open question. What ideas do you think might be ripe to take from research to practice? And I'll leave that open to anyone who wants to jump in.
We recently did with Dr. Steiner, we did a study on using community-based participatory approach to smart city planning. So when we started that project, I believe like our thinking and perspective was completely different. Going into that project, we're thinking in terms of how people will use technology and what kind of smart solutions they want in terms of transit, and we went in with that approach. But when we actually did that study, we got completely different response. So just to kind of summarize that study, we chose two different contrasting neighborhoods. One was a relatively well-doing, wealthy neighborhood, and another one in East Gainesville with the low-income neighborhood. What we realized was, sometimes, when you bring up all these ideas, for example, even like the autonomous shuttle, like any kind of new, bright and shiny thing, when the current transportation planning hasn't been beneficial to a certain set of population, they might even look at it, with even resentment. So one of the things to learn that we did from that study is that, a community-based approach where you go into those communities, identify the community leaders, work with them when you're doing your focus groups and surveys, so that when you do those focus groups and surveys, you at least know that you're asking the right questions. Sometimes we might not even be asking the right questions. So I think that is something, it may not be that much of a change in terms of technology or anything, but then those are the small, key, nuts and bolts thing that can have a bigger impact. Dr. Steiner, do you want to take on that?
Sure, I'll take that on. I think your statement on participatory processes and understanding what people want and need. Carlos gave a couple of really good examples of that being done in Miami. And I came out of that project convinced that the whole tip of the iceberg on how to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially in providing transit. And one of the lessons I've taken out of the COVID situation is that when we look at the declines in ridership, transit was serving essential workers. And, we can quibble about whether essential is the right word and what essential workers means. But the reality is there are certain places. I looked at some national data and it showed, for instance, that Miami had a lower reduction in transit usage during COVID than many other places. And in my mind, that was people who could not get around by any other mode were sticking with transit because the transit agencies were sticking with them. And I think, and the work we did on microtransit, we looked at the declines in ridership, and similarly within the Gainesville transit system, the lowest declines were in the lower income communities. And again, it goes back to my basic point of the essential nature of public transit for certain populations who are are reducing the congestion on the roadways for the rest of us. And they have fewer choices about how they get around. And I personally, just from a moral and ethical stance, hope that we remember this long-term in our transit. But I also, out of doing this microtransit project, and I think I've come to believe that microtransit, we need a lot more exploration in microtransit. But it is, I think I think we're still figuring out what the right niche is. Is it late service? Is it supplemental service? Is it service in low density neighborhoods only? There's lots of experiments in other places in Florida. Pinellas County, where in the Tampa Bay area has been doing a lot of work. Sarasota has been re-engineering their transit agency. And I actually believe a research to practice opportunity, not just in Florida, because I've seen discussion nationally, but I really think that the figuring out is microtransit a key to build ridership, possibly in places that have historically not had ridership. Does the on-demand nature of it have other applications? Can it be used in the paratransit world, where if you look at people who are using paratransit, some are using it because they can't get to a bus stop, but does a door-to-door service mean that you could segment the populations who are on paratransit to those that need a special equipment to get around versus those who could use a less expensive solution than traditional paratransit, but more expensive than traditional transit?
Yeah. Art, I know we're running out of time, but if I may, first, Ruth, I think this is an open invitation for you to come down to Miami and see everything that's going on in here. But let me tell you something, what we found out through the health crisis, and I think this is something to learn, right? It's being on theory and now into practice. The best marketing tool that we can get to get people back on transit is frequency. Right. So while you mentioned that we reduce and we're not as far as others, let me tell you something. We did reduce service from the most of our services, but we added Now, we basically restore services in the main corridors, and we continue to add it to the tune that we added 120 buses beyond our current fleet to be supplemental services on the major corridors. And those routes were actually carrying more people during COVID than in 2019. So it tells you that from theory to practice, frequency is the way to go. And at the same time, we're able to prove that, the transit as we know it, while it is for everyone, it's not necessarily for every trip. And I think that's where you come in. Microtransit can play a big role, micromobility play a big role, our on-demand partnership play a big role. And there is a lot of potential partnerships that we can do to make sure that we maximize the use of the big buses because they're very efficient. Right. Right now, again, we're carrying more people in some of the corridors in before COVID. And I'm thrilled to tell you too that as of last week, our board approved unanimously our Better Bus Network, which is a full network redesign that is focusing on creating high-frequency corridors throughout Miami-Dade County. So I think that is really the stepping stone to make sure that we understand the frequency is the most important thing, and there's room for private mobility solution to be participant, and there's room for on-demand transit and micromobility and all these things, and autonomous shuttles. All that is part of it, and really that diversity is what make it work. And I'm seeing that already happening here. I've seen a lot of innovation in on-demand transportation, not only in the partnership that we have with VIA, but we have a freebie, which is low-speed electric vehicles like golf carts with open windows, phenomenal. Pretty much every municipality here have them. So there's really a lot of that. The supply of services is important as far as the infrastructure, and that's going to get us where we need to go. But I'm very enthusiastic about that, and I think we need to kind of make sure that we bring people down here to see it because it's really happening here.
I'm glad we had that conversation because that's very relevant, very timely, and that's part of the world we're in, figuring out those kind of questions. And I want to pick up on that. But before that, I want to weave one more thing. We have about 8 minutes. I want to make sure that I bring up a question. It doesn't have to be a long conversation, but I want to bring up the workforce issue. And because in my conversations with transit systems all over the country, that is a common theme everywhere. And not just in transit business, it's a theme. Turn on the news and it's everything, but it affects us directly. I mean, even meeting daily service needs. So I just want to ask perhaps Jesus and Carlos, but Dr. Steiner, you and Prithvi, your perspectives as well on workforce. Any pearl of wisdom and any light you see, anything you might say that could be helpful to others?
Well, this is a big challenge. Right now, we 46 drivers short. So for the level of service we canceling service. The challenge is trying to go and meet the demand. So we're supposed to be adding more service instead of cutting, and that's what we're facing right now. I closed my door because we have a job fair trying to recruit drivers in the next 2 days. We going to churches. We taking the buses to and trying to recruit people out of there and trying to interview them right on the spot. So we at the state association we be dealing and talking about that. What the raisings, the salary ranges for the drivers is a main concern here because we have a minimum $15 per hour of salary, and we need to match that at least to attract drivers. The benefits and the risk of COVID is on every applicant. That's how you're going to maintain us safe. So have a campaign about safety. That it's safe to work in transit, it's safe to ride the buses.
I had not much more to add. Of course, we're hurting, to a bigger tune than that, but a bigger agency. And I think what we need to do is stick together and create a more, a really good communication about how it is a safe environment and is needed. I think we need to be, speaking together about the value that the transit operators bring to our community, right? And I think that we don't often kind of highlight them in that way. So our campaign right now is about that. It's really kind of making sure they understand they're going to be value in our community, and we need them to be part of the solution because without transit, our cities will come to a halt, right? There's no other way to go around it. So we need to make sure that we do everything we can together as a nation, as all the different cities and agencies together on making the message strong.
I'm glad you asked the workforce development question, because I actually am, it's in final form, finalizing a study where we're looking at workforce development in the Southeast in transportation in general. And while transit will continue to have drivers until autonomy becomes more ubiquitous, there still are going to be changes because of the autonomy issue. There's going to be a need for, there's a much greater need for transportation to be much broader in its connection, both from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, but also because we're going to see the electrification is going to mean we're going to need, and on demand and apps and all of that is going to mean we're going to need more computer scientists. We're going to need more technically competent workforce at the professional level and even at the entry level. I mean, people working on controller boxes and some of those basic skill sets, some of which is in transit agencies, but also in other transportation agencies. It's the need for those technical skills is going to be even greater in the near future.
Yeah. All the way across the board. The final question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to start with you, Dr. Steiner, but I'd like everyone to think about your response. And this is another overarching question, and it involves the benefits of transit, the value of transit, and perhaps how to measure that. Metrics. The ridership, probably wrongly, has been used as a metric. It hasn't been right for a long time, and it's absolutely not right now, right? I mean, the pandemic proved that. We were asking people to not ride, but we were still there in an essential way, right? To keep the economy going, to keep cities moving, et cetera, et cetera. So we need metrics, access to opportunity, et cetera. So I want to ask Dr. Steiner, because she's written on this topic about your recent article you wrote titled, "Is Mass Transit on the Eve of a Renaissance?" And it talks about transit benefits. So I'd like you to comment, unfortunately, briefly on that, but I'd like all of the other panelists to add what their perspective is on transit's value to the community. Dr. Steiner first.
Well, the idea I was pushing is actually comes from, I have to give it to the transit center, where often in transit we think of choice riders and people who are transit dependent, but they make the valid point that what you really, when you look at it, is you have potential users, people who currently aren't using transit. You have those who use transit primarily for commuting, and then you have the populations that use it. Some of them use it for all trips. Now, maybe you can have 4 categories. And the fourth is people who, if you think of people going to football games or basketball games or places that are at event venues that tend to be congested. And if we begin to think about that, and I'll use the example in Gainesville, when we started thinking about students as a group of riders as separate from residents of the community, that's when transit ridership started increasing. And the way transit agencies really need to think about it is, historically, we've been so dependent upon the commute to work, the traditional 9-to-5 office worker. But in fact, there are other kinds of trips that are served quite conveniently by transit that we haven't necessarily, and one way to think about it is, what are the niches for transit usage?
Others, a final comment on the value of transit to communities? Carlos?
Yeah, I think this is on point. The way we measure and the way we did the Better Bus Network was about access to opportunities, right? And I think that's an excellent point. When we talk about that, it's all day. Our frequent corridor is going to be frequent from 6 in the morning to 10 p.m. We want to make sure that people have that, and it can be part of your decision making when you do things. Transit can really help our communities grow, right? So right now, even in the smart plan, on the 6 corridor that we have, 3/4 of our employment and 2/3 of our population live within 2 miles of those corridors. When we continue to do transit-oriented development, and we continue to build along transit lines, we continue to build grow this smart, and at the same time allow for mobility solution to be participant in that, right? So I think it's really about growth, economic vitality, and making sure the infrastructure we put in there, it is critical and is done in a way that can allow our communities to thrive. Transit is strong. The one thing I can tell you, Art, is perhaps in 2021 or perhaps 2022, we can start changing the term of transit. And what does that mean? Before it was bus and rail. Today, I'm venturing to say it is bus and rail plus everything else that can connect people to opportunities. So let's talk about that and expand that and really move towards the new version of transit.
Jesus?
And not much to add to Carlos. It's more convenient, trying to make it a transit more convenient, on-demand service and use technology for any transit applications. We're way behind on technology applications in transit, and we have these research projects that are helping us a lot. I guess Pruthvi mentioned something like technology that we have a pedestrian detection on buses, so we could identify the hot spots on pedestrian potential accidents. So we redesigned the streets to be more convenient for the pedestrians and the access to transit. So the use of technology is a good component to enhance and measure transit service.
Prithvi, you get the last word.
I guess I get to summarize everything everyone said. So I guess so yeah, I think we definitely need to think beyond commute to work idea. So in some of our study, we found that people have questions like I'm not able to get access to healthcare because there is no direct bus route to my my clinic, or I'm in a food desert because I don't have a direct transit connection to a fresh market. So we need to think on those lines, and also as as Carlos mentioned, I'm sorry, I'm blanking out, but so we need to look redefine transportation in everything that we discussed today, in terms of everything we discussed today.
Well, thanks everyone. We're at time, but it's been a truly fabulous conversation, and I will. Is there any interim announcements to make, Chad? Or do we just go into a break or proceed to the next session? Or do we just sign off?
I think Chad must have been distracted.
I think we
Hello,
were.
my apologies. I got a call for, and I thought that might be somebody for the next session, but it turns out somebody that was yelling at me in Russian, so I had to hang up. Thank you so much for your presentations and for your participation. Great session, Art. Thank you so much, Ruth, Jesus, Carlos, and Pruthvi. Great insights into what's going on in Florida. So now we'll be moving on to a break for about 12 minutes. So we'll be back at 11:15 Pacific, 2:15 Eastern. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for coming back and joining us again. My name is Carrie Watkins. I'm one of the co-organizers of the conference, and I'm an associate professor at Georgia Tech in civil and environmental engineering. And I'm so glad to have three colleagues, most of whom I've known for a very long time, joining us today, and others whose research I've been watching for a very long time. So I think you're really going to enjoy this talk. We decided as we were organizing that we wanted to take up the topic of travel trends during the COVID era. And it's actually amazing how much research has been done in a very short time in trying to help not just transit agencies, but in general, people who look at travel behavior, how all of that has changed during COVID. And so we have three amazing speakers. Let me introduce them quickly, and then we'll hear from each of them. Dr. Candace Brakewood is an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Her teaching and research focus on public transit and new shared mobility modes. She recently co-authored a TCRP report, a Transit Cooperative Research Program report, on recent declines in public transportation ridership that was focused prior to COVID-19. But she is an associate director of the T-Score University Center, which is seeking to define strategic visions for transit into the future. And part of her research through that we'll hear about today is looking at ridership changes during COVID on transit systems. Dr. Deborah Salan is an associate professor in geographical sciences and urban planning at Arizona State. In her research, Dr. Salan asks questions relating to the effects of transportation infrastructure, the built environment, and public policy on the choices that people make. She believes that smart policies implemented by the right people have the potential to improve our lives, make society more equitable, and reduce our impact on the environment. And we're going to hear about a large study that she's had ongoing that looks at many aspects, not just transit ridership, but many aspects of travel during COVID-19. And Dr. Calvin Thigpen is the director of policy research at Lime, where he conducts Lime's internal research and oversees external collaborations with the aim to better understand who uses micromobility, how and why they ride, and impacts on the environment, equity, and other topics. He's contributed to research reports on topics ranging from the impact of COVID-19 on shared micromobility, which is what we're going to hear about today, to scooter parking behavior and solutions. So with that, I'm first going to turn it over to Candace. Again, we welcome questions or comments in the chat or the Q&A, and they're happy to take them towards the end of the session.
Thank you, Carrie. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started and present some preliminary results of an ongoing study on transit ridership during COVID. This is going to be an exploratory analysis showing nationwide trends of 2020. First, I'd like to acknowledge my PhD student, Abubak, who is the lead researcher on this project. So he's done an excellent job with this. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Carrie Watkins, because the primary funder of this research is the T-Score UTC Center, of which Carrie is the director. So with that, the motivation for this talk today is what you see in front of you, which is a 100-year picture of fixed route transit ridership in this country from 1920 to 2020. The black shows total fixed route transit ridership, the blue shows rail ridership, and the red shows bus. As you can see on the far right, in 2020, transit experienced massive declines and actually hit the lowest overall ridership level since 1920 and the lowest rail ridership level since 1920. So really huge drop in transit ridership. So we simply wanted to just explore what happened last year. How did transit ridership change comparing 2020 to 2019 across different modes, so bus versus rail, across different metropolitan areas. We do use the MSA, the Metropolitan Statistical Area, as our unit of analysis for the exploratory analysis you're going to see next. Our primary data source is the National Transit Database, so all the agencies that report into the NTD. And I should note, since there are lots of agencies reporting in, what we've done is group them by MSA and then further group the metropolitan statistical areas by size. So the smaller agencies based on their level of operating expense, low, medium, and high. New York is done separate. So I'll note that we did New York separately because it's so much larger than the others. So I'll start with New York and then move to the other groups, mid-size, low, and high. So what you are looking at here is a chart showing the rail service in the New York Metropolitan Statistical Area. On the x-axis, we have by month from January 2020 to December 2020. On the y-axis, we're showing the percent change. So the blue line shows service provision, that's in vehicle revenue miles, VRM, and the orange line shows ridership in unlinked passenger trips, or UPT. First, you can note that there was an extreme drop in the New York metropolitan area in April of 2020, which is not surprising given the COVID-19 pandemic. So in April 2020, we see ridership dropping by 92% across the New York MSA. And then it does come back some by the end of the year, but it still remains quite low. So 68% drop as compared to the previous December by the end of the year. Service provision, there was initially some fairly large cuts, primarily again in April 2020, drops in vehicle revenue miles of about 39%. But then, as you can see by the blue line, service recovered or was restored for the most part, so only about 7% less by the end of the year. This is just for rail service in the New York metropolitan area. On the bus side, so this is the same graphic, but simply showing bus statistics, we see fairly similar trends here. So again, orange is showing your ridership in on-link passenger trips. Blue is showing your service provision in vehicle revenue miles. And again, that steepest decline is in April 2020. On the ridership, about 77% drop in bus ridership across the region, and a 38% cut in vehicle revenue miles across the region. I should note, though, by the end of 2020, bus ridership was back to about 50% of its initial. So the bus ridership in general experienced slightly less of a decline as compared to what we just saw on the last slide for the rail service. Likely because there are more transit dependent and essential workers using the bus service, but that will require further research. So now let's look at the trends for 19 large metropolitan statistical areas. This is a group that we call our high operating expenses, essentially our large transit operators, including cities like Chicago, San Francisco, Dallas, Denver. First, looking at the rail service. So this map is showing you those 19 MSAs I just mentioned that have, they provide large service. And this is comparing 2020 ridership levels in on-link passenger trips with the previous year, 2019. What you'll notice is Chicago had the most loss in ridership. So they experienced a decrease of 189 million unlinked passenger trips, a 67% reduction. Other cities that experienced quite large reductions were San Francisco, 73% loss in unlinked passenger trips, and Washington, D.C., which lost 71% across 2020 in unlinked passenger trips. Some of the cities that weren't as severely affected in percentage terms were places like Dallas, Houston, San Diego. However, they start out at lower levels of ridership to begin with. Now, if we aggregate those same 19 metropolitan statistical areas, again for the rail service, what we can see here is the change over time, again for 2020. So from January to December, again, this is the 19 MSAs I was just talking about with Chicago, San Francisco, Dallas, et cetera, all aggregated together. Similar to New York, in April 2020, we see massive decline. So on-link passenger trips dropped by 87%, and they only recovered slightly by the end of the year. Still, December 2020, ridership levels were down 76% across these rail providers, which is a pretty massive loss. The service provision, again, cut by about 37% in April, and in May, about 47%, but did recover to about 20% only drop by the end of the year. For those same 19 MSAs, if we look on the bus side, we see similar trends, but in general, less severe. So the ridership on the bus side dropped to about 72% in April and recovered to about half its previous level by the end of the year. Service provision on the bus side dropped by about 27 to 29%, and then back to only about 13% less by the end of the year. So kind of similar trends, but less severe on the bus as compared to the rail. Now, if we move to medium-sized operators, this is going to be 22 MSAs, including places that I'll show you on the next slide. So places like Portland, Maine, Nashville, Kansas City, Charlotte, Sacramento, et cetera. This chart is looking at MSAs, just ones that have rail service. So what we've done in this graphic is broken it down by different types of rail. And we started to notice some interesting trends. Orange is for commuter rail, dark blue is heavy rail, light blue is light rail and streetcar. And what you can see with those dots in orange on the upper right, commuter rail experienced the most dramatic declines. It was the most impacted as compared to light rail, heavy rail, et cetera. With some of these smaller commuter rail operators like Portland, Nashville, et cetera, seeing massive drops on the order of 78%, 70 to 80% for their annual ridership last year. Light rail, streetcar, not as affected, but still pretty significant declines as well. When we aggregated those same 22 MSAs and present the same type of chart I showed you for the previous group, we see, again, these similar trends. So this is for those 22 mid-level, this is rail service providers. We see, again, a drop of about 76% of ridership in April 2020, only recovering still at the end of the year, 65% down when we aggregate them all. So still pretty strong declines on the rail side. For those same cities, if we look at their bus service, we see that bus ridership dropped slightly less, 65% in April 2020, and recovered to 50% levels by the end of the year. So similar trends, again, but less severe on the bus side. Finally, we looked at a lot of small bus operators. So these are ones we called low operating expenses. It included 146 different metropolitan statistical areas, places like Gainesville, Florida, Rome, Georgia, et cetera. Here's a map showing you where those places are. And I've highlighted a few cities that had very large drops here. So for example, Gainesville, Florida lost 5.4 million unlinked passenger trips, which is 59% of their ridership. Similarly, State College, Pennsylvania lost 4.49 million, which represents 70% of their ridership as compared to the previous year. Blacksburg, Virginia, similar trend, 69% loss. So some of these cities are college towns that were quite heavily impacted in terms of, the universities were impacted and then their transit systems were impacted. But you also see similar losses across many other smaller cities as well. When we aggregated those 146 small operators, bus operators together, what we ended up seeing is this chart. So this is over the last year. Again, in April 2020, our unlinked passenger trips decreased by 75% in total, and they did recover to about 50% of previous year by December 2020. Service levels, again, dropped by about a third in April, down 31%, and recovered to only about a 10% loss by the end of the year. One last thing to show you before I wrap up here, we wanted to compare the productivity level. So very common way to look at productivity of a transit agency is to take their unlinked passenger trips, their ridership, and compare that to their vehicle revenue miles. So what we did was compare that for both the rail and the bus side. On the left-hand side, you have your large agencies or high operating expenses on top and those mid-sized rail operators on the bottom. On the right, we have bus with high, mid, and lower, those large agencies, medium agencies, and small agencies. On the x-axis for both of these is unlinked passenger trips per vehicle revenue mile as our primary measure of productivity. It's for 2019 on the x-axis and for 2020 on the y-axis. And the key thing here is the trends look very similar, regardless of if it's bus, regardless of if it's rail, and regardless of how large the MSA group is. Basically, productivity was cut in half last year if we look at the annual statistics, regardless of which group they're in. So productivity down about 50% when we use this measure of unlinked passenger trips per vehicle revenue mile. So with that, I'm going to just wrap up in our exploratory analysis of the trends across the country in terms of transit ridership from last year. So as I started out saying, overall ridership and rail ridership hit 100-year lows last year. And regardless of which MSA group we were looking at, the small, medium, or large operators, regardless of if it was bus or rail, the most drop occurred in April 2020, which was not surprising given all the shutdowns and travel restrictions that were occurring. When we dug into the differences between modes and We found a couple of noteworthy things. So between the rail modes, we saw commuter rail was the most heavily impacted. When we compared bus and rail in general, bus ridership experienced less declines in percentage terms, likely because they have more essential workers, transit-dependent riders than on some of the rail systems in the same cities. And last, we looked a little bit at productivity levels, which across the board pretty much decreased in half when you look at annual statistics. So with that, that's a really kind of high-level snapshot of what happened last year. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is ongoing research, so we are working on statistical analysis and some modeling of this data as the next step in the project. But thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Yeah, I think we're going to wait until all three of you have presented. So let's turn it over to Deborah now.
Awesome. All right. Figure out my sharing here. Okay, can everyone see my slides and hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Awesome. Great. All right. So the question that that I'm going to be talking about and that our research team has been looking at is not so much what happened during the pandemic, which we just heard from Candace in some detail, but more how will the pandemic experience affect transportation choices into the future? Let's see. So as we all know, we have been required to make large changes to our daily lives, especially related to transport and mobility because of the pandemic. I guess some people haven't, but most people have. And so this is our question. And we conducted a national survey to try to answer this question. This survey we call the COVID Future Survey. And if you want to find more information, I'll have this website up later too. But you can go to www.covidfuture.org and there's all kinds of information. Just to let you know, this is not just me. I'm part of a large research team of people working both at Arizona State University and the University of Illinois at Chicago. So what did this survey look like? So we asked people, about their employment, about, kind of whether they're students, and then about other trips they make, shopping trips, whether they, dine at restaurants, their daily transportation, their commute trips. We asked them attitudinal questions and basic demographics. So the survey was between 15 and 30 minutes, the initial survey. And it's a multi-wave survey. So as of now, we've collected 2 waves of data and we're working on collecting a third wave. Hopefully we're going to be launching next week, wave 3. So the first wave we collected between April 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, and October. And we collected about 9,000 survey responses from across the US. I'm going to be talking about a subsample of these, and I can go into why, but the people that I'm going to be talking about answered the survey essentially between July and October. Wave 2, we launched in November, went through about April, and we collected about 3,000 more survey responses, which I'm not going to be talking about today, but I can say that the results are not super different from what we saw in wave 1. And like I said, we're deploying wave 3 very soon. So you can see where the people came from who answered our survey. Largely, they are more or less, spatially representative of where people live in the U.S. Not perfectly, and with a tremendous oversample in Arizona, and for a number of reasons related to the way that we collected our data. But we did weight all of our data to match regional distributions along these 7 variables. And we also, each region was weighted so that it would represent its share of the population. So that huge oversample in Arizona has been weighted down essentially so that the results I'm showing you don't really overrepresent Arizona. So what did we find when we looked at what people would be doing? mostly, thinking about not just during the pandemic, but like what's going on in the future. And I'm going to start by talking about working from home. I know this conversation is mostly about transit, but as you'll see, a lot more working from home translates into a lot fewer transit trips. So that's why this is an important piece. So our data forecast a large increase in remote work, and not just remote work now, but remote work in the post-pandemic future. And so we asked people, the way we got this information on the survey is we asked people both what they're doing now, so you can see that in this middle bar, or from 2020. And then we also say, well, once the pandemic, once COVID-19 is no longer a threat, what do you expect you'll be doing? And so that's how we got these answers over here, the post-COVID expectations. So some people might, what if their employers don't let them and all this? Well, we did ask, they don't know, right? These are expectations, but we did ask, before we asked them what they expected to do in terms of work from home, we first asked them, do you expect to be allowed to work from home? And if they said yes, did we then say, well, how frequently do you expect you'll actually do it? So although this isn't perfect, we think it's it's people's best guess at whether they're going to be allowed to work from home and how much they will. So in any case, so you can see here, there's a big increase, right? Pre-pandemic, and this is working from home at least a few times a month. There was about 23% of our survey respondents, or working survey respondents, said that they did work from home occasionally, or somewhat regularly. During the pandemic, this number went up quite a bit. If you don't count the blue piece, which is the people who became unemployed during the pandemic, this ends up being about 50% of workers. And then the post-COVID expectations don't go down very much from the COVID actual in terms of, just do you or don't you expect to work from home a few times a month. You can see here, this is a Sankey plot of, the more details on whether people said a few times a month or more, or a few times a week or more, whether they had the option. And I won't go into this in detail, except to say that you can see, these people who said yes, most of them during the pandemic are actually working from home pretty much full time. Whereas here you can see there's some people saying a few times a week or more, but quite a few people saying a few times a month. It shouldn't be or more, but in any case, it's not. It's sometimes working from home, not every single day. And so I took that information and I put it together with information that the respondents gave me about whether they commuted by car or by transit or walking or whatever. And I tried to figure out how much that decrease in traveling to work would actually translate into a decrease in car commuting. And transit commuting is the next slide. So you can see here that the total percentage of people, if you put all the purples together, the percentage of people who say that, when I commute, my main mode is a car, hasn't changed appreciably between the pre and post-COVID periods. But the people who say they are always commuting, meaning like every day, has gone down quite a bit. And this is because of that increase in remote work. If you look at transit, the story is actually even more extreme. So here, most people don't commute by transit in the US. And so the numbers don't look very big when you go up to 100% of our survey respondents. So I have another slide that only looks at that 10% that do commute that include all the transit commuters essentially. But transit commuters, it turns out, are even more likely to say, yes, I'm planning to telecommute rather frequently than car commuters. And so a lot of transit commuters, the people who always used to commute by transit, were 6% pre-pandemic and only 2% post-COVID. So this represents a big drop. And this is a different drop than what Candace was talking about in the previous presentation, where she was talking about transit commuting, during 2020 when people were still concerned about the disease. This is transit commuting even post-COVID, when they're not concerned about, getting infected with a virus while taking a transit vehicle. So this is certainly concerning. And a lot of it is due to the fact that transit commuters are more likely to say that they're planning to telecommute part-time. I'll skip over this, but well, this just equates, when I did the math and figured out, how far people were driving to work previously, this equates to about a 15% reduction in car commute vehicle miles traveled, all of which comes from more telecommuting. And for transit, though, a 40% projected drop in transit commute trips per week. Half from telecommute increases and half from mode switching. So quite a few people were switching all the way to 100% telecommuting, and quite a few people were switching toward another mode, mostly driving, a few people, but it ended up, that switching to driving hardly registered on the car commute mode share because so few people took transit to begin with. Anyway, this is a big deal for transit, though, because half of pre-COVID transit ridership was from commute trips based on the NHTS data from 2017. So this is a big deal for transit agencies and something that, I think they are already thinking about carefully and should continue to do so. So this is where I'll stop. Our data are actually publicly available. You can download them and, run whatever analyses you'd like yourself. And you can go to our website and there's a data download link that'll take you to another website, the repository where the data actually are located. And I'll just say thanks so much for listening. And thanks to our sponsors.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Calvin, you want to take over?
I will share my screen. One moment, let me just pull it up. Okay. All right. How does that look?
Yes, it looks good. Thank you.
All right. So excited to be here today remotely. Really excited to share some, again, like a little bit different than just your sort of traditional transit focus. I think many people don't necessarily see micromobility as sort of on the same standing as traditional transit. I do think there are some interesting parallels and maybe worth thinking about micromobility from that lens. And just very excited to share what I've seen, from my vantage point as the director of policy research at Lime, and then just more broadly industry trends. I do have a lot to share, so feel free to keep me honest on time. These are the 4 topics I'll cover in today's presentation. First off, just really starting with what, from our perspective, what we're seeing in our conversations with cities around the globe, the challenges that cities are facing. Obviously, first and foremost, how do you move people safely around a city during a pandemic is, the topic of this symposium panel, and also on the forefront of cities' minds. And then, of course, climate change as well. We're seeing an increase in the frequency and intensity of fires, floods, hurricanes, you name it. How do you mitigate? How do you adapt? And arguably, providing green micromobility infrastructure is one of the best ways that you can sort of check both of those boxes. And then cutting across everything that cities are thinking about and we at Lime are thinking about is equity, to make sure everyone benefits equally and no group is disproportionately impacted. And so thinking about micromobility's role in these 3 realms, I think it's helpful to look to history with previous pandemics. What we're seeing play out with bicycling, e-bikes, e-scooters during the COVID pandemic really mirrors what a lot of Southeast Asian countries saw during the SARS pandemic, for example. And Chris Cherry has done a great job documenting this as well. Just as we are seeing, a spike in acoustic and electric bike sales over the past 2 years, as you can see in that lower chart, In China in 2003, there was a massive 15 times increase in e-bike sales. And that was when e-bikes were sort of still, nobody knew what an e-bike was. On my side, early on in the pandemic, I surveyed the general public in 5 global cities, and respondents, sort of similar to what Deborah was presenting. I asked about their previous use of different modes, how they were using it during the pandemic, and then what they anticipated for the future. And across the board, respondents maintained their current use of scooters, shared scooters during the pandemic, and they were eager to use it more frequently in the future. And we've seen this bear out in cities like New York. This is maybe similar data as you saw in Candace's presentation. Ayun Wang and Bob Nolan from Rutgers have done a really good job of documenting how bike share in New York City rebounded faster than the subway, which, as Candace mentioned, still hasn't recovered, while bike share is now surpassing pre-COVID demand. And then, the second major city challenge or concern around sustainability, micromobility also has a role to play here, especially in terms of the mode's lifetime impact in terms of CO2 per passenger mile or passenger kilometer. The graph on the left and the number on the left comes from a study back in 2019 from researchers at North Carolina State. They ran an LCA and estimated about 126 grams of CO2 per passenger kilometer. A year later, ITF estimated about a 15% lower impact figure. And there are micromobility companies on record saying that they are seeing their scooters are at 40 to 60 grams per passenger kilometer. And this makes a big difference as we're going from those early days of shared scooters to what we're seeing now with much more robust hardware and better operations. It means that shared scooters impact is changing and being a net positive. The ITF number was on par with public buses, ICE buses. And as you see shared scooter companies continue to ratchet down this number, it really changes the calculus and improves the calculus on the sustainability impact, especially when you start to consider mode shift. In many North American cities, we see mode shift from motor vehicles to shared scooters on the range of anywhere from 25% to maximum I've seen is about 50%. And so when you combine the lifetime impact of scooters and the lifetime impact of the modes they're replacing, obviously the more cars, the more ride hailing you replace, the better. And as you bring LCAs down to being better than transit, you also are going to see improved gains there. Also, equity is an important consideration for cities, and micromobility, especially dockless models, can really improve on the distribution and accessibility and improving it for residents across the city. This figure is from a recent paper from Amy Brown at University of Oregon, showing that dockless providers provide a broader, more equitable service area than docked bike share. And then on top of that, Lime and other operators have low income programs to provide discounted rides as well. And I think essentially every micromobility company had some sort of essential worker program during the early stages of the pandemic to connect workers to their jobs. And so I'm going to pivot a bit to thinking about what's coming. There are a variety of efforts that Lime and other micromobility companies have taken during the pandemic to adapt and to help address city goals. From my research and from my survey work, I think there's some clear further steps that cities can take to maximize the benefits of micromobility. And so I'll cover both of these areas in the following slides. One area that we focused on at Lime is introducing a variety of different modes on the same platform. We're well known for our scooters. We acquired Jump and now have Jump bikes. And we also have begun to introduce mopeds as part of our platform. And what this does is it provides different modes that might fit different, that we've seen from our survey data, fit different rider profiles, different trip purposes, which means that as a comprehensive, more cohesive package, these modes as a whole can start to sort of unbundle the car and provide a realistic alternative. Lime is also featured in Google Maps, Uber, a growing number of transit apps, including City Mapper, which makes choosing micromobility an easier choice. And then especially in the case of the Uber integration, it can encourage people to choose the appropriate vehicle for their trip. Why use ride hail when you can take a scooter or a bike for that short urban trip? And we've seen, like as I alluded to, we've seen from our data that multimodality helps encourage reductions in car use, and one mode, be it the bike or be it the scooter, helps sort of serve as an entry point for riders to explore other green lightweight modes. And as you can see from this map on the right, bikes tend to cover a broader territory. You can cover more ground more easily on a bike. And this is even more true now with our mopeds, while scooters tend to be focused on shorter trips in sort of downtown cores. Another step we've taken at Lime has been to partner with the World Wildlife Foundation and its One Planet City Challenge to develop a Ride Green commitment. And really the cornerstone of this partnership is an aggressive path towards a net zero business. And we're following science-based targets to get there. And what I find incredibly encouraging about working at Lime is that improving life cycle and business aspects is a path that the industry as a whole is also heading down. So we're pleased to see other companies making similar pledges. But focusing a bit on what we're doing here at Lime, we're following the science, we're following our internal data, we're allowing others to conduct independent life cycle analyses to understand how we can reduce our carbon impacts as we shoot towards net zero. For those who are familiar with micromobility, it should be no surprise that our vehicles and our operations are the largest, sort of most impactful levers that we can pull to reduce our impacts. And then expanding and increasing our use of renewable energy is another important option for us to explore. And then in addition to those three key pillars, there are further reductions we can make. And then the final one, our mode shift, will therefore represent a net carbon negative business as that sort of final step. So all of this means we'll be fully accounting for the entire scooter life cycle and carbon impact and corporate impacts rather than just that first carbon-free ride from point A to B. So we're in the midst of actually going through this process. We established a benchmark last year, and now we are in the midst of reevaluating and inventorying our carbon emissions for this past the first half of 2021. We're partnering with local renewable energy providers. We're electrifying our van fleet. For those of you in California, you should see electric vans, operation vans on streets early next year. We're trying to find creative solutions to figure out what to do with our batteries once they've sort of reached the end of their usable life. One option we've been working with a UK firm to provide batteries as portable speakers or portable battery charging packs. And so by 2025, we are committed to being a carbon negative company on the path to net zero emissions. And then that last piece, that third piece around equity, As I mentioned earlier, we have Lime Access. We're expanding that across the globe. We recently added some Australian and New Zealand cities to this program. And we're just eager in general to work with cities to ensure equitable access. We worked in this example, I'm showing the city of Chicago. We worked to deploy our cities in equity zones. We voluntarily implemented discounts in those zones, and we saw some clear and dramatic signs of success through improved ridership. And then we've also extended that focus on equity to extend beyond just riders to also include hiring and DEI initiatives at Lime. And then in terms of the city role, I'll quickly touch on a couple of points. The first being infrastructure. As I alluded to earlier, in that survey I did of the general public in 5 cities around the world, we found very high levels of support for slow streets. Many people wanted to make them permanent. If you add up the people who want to keep at least some changes or all changes, it's 80% of all respondents. This is showing that it's a really positive program that many people, not just bicycle or scooter riders, can rally behind. Another analysis we conducted was looking at our ridership data. One major advantage of Lime is we have this longitudinal ridership data across many cities. And so what we did is we zoomed in on 3 European cities where they had done as many cities did around the globe. They selected cities around the streets around the city to close them to car traffic. And we compared streets that had been converted to slow streets, those that had never had any bike lanes, and those that had always had bike lanes across 2 different time periods. And what we found was that from February to June of 2020, we saw an overall increase in ridership and in distance traveled, likely due to just better weather. And when you compare the sort of specific street segment types, we see that the no bike lanes and the pre-existing bike lanes had increases, but not as substantial as overall trends. And in contrast, slow streets on the far right showed massive growth, really demonstrating the latent demand for these safe spaces to walk and bike and scoot. We're actually in the midst of replicating this analysis with a team of researchers from the University of Southern California to look at some cities in North America. And thus far, we're seeing similar patterns, suggesting that these street transformations really have lasting value beyond just the pandemic. Another point I'd like to make is that when we look at our mode shift data, we've found that a portion of micromobility trips do replace transit, but we also see that nearly 1 in 5 trips enable transit use by connecting riders to or from a transit trip. And we also see, as you can see on the bottom, nearly half of riders are making regular connections to transit from micromobility, showing how micromobility and transit can really fit nicely together in a transportation lifestyle. And then during COVID, as the trip making patterns of cities have flattened, so if you look at, this is the city of Berlin, if you look up from July 2019 to July 2020, you see that the sort of heat map of trips is broadened out. We've also seen that pattern happen temporally as well, with less peaky travel patterns. It's going to become, and it's already become, more difficult for transit agencies to run their traditional sort of hub and spoke style transit going into downtown cores. And this, I think, is an example of the flexibility that micromobility could provide to help address this more diffuse travel demand. In the past, Lime has partnered with transit agencies during temporary transit shutdowns in Paris and Portland and other areas to provide alternative service for travelers. And I think it's worth exploring more longer term arrangements like that are more deliberative and collaborative between transit agencies and micromobility to really harness that flexibility. And again, I'd like to say thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to share what we found and what we're seeing. And I look forward to any questions.
Great, thank you all. It's a few minutes after already, but I see that we have a couple of questions. Candace answered one in the chat, but Candace, if you want to vocalize, I see that there was a question as you were presenting how you were accounting for limits some transit agencies placed on vehicle capacity. So some agencies were, for the sake of crowding, they were limiting how many people could be in a vehicle. Do you think that these might have impacted ridership? And I would add on to that, and because I already know what the answer is because you put it in the chat, but if you want to expand just a little bit, in general, sort of this idea that service numbers may have only come down a little bit, but actually many agencies like my home agency of MARTA here in Atlanta, they actually refocused service to be on certain core routes because they were worried about crowding on those routes. So it wasn't, even if service numbers were similar, it wasn't necessarily the same routes.
Yeah, there were so many service changes and general policy changes, particularly during those initial months of the COVID-19 pandemic, that we haven't controlled for any of that in the slides I showed you. Those were simply meant to just show you the trends, kind of capture what happened. In the next stage of the research project, we're starting to compile information on some of these policy changes, et cetera, service changes that were made by specific transit agencies. A lot of that we actually will have to do manually by checking their websites, et cetera, to compile that type of information, such as vehicle capacity limits, et cetera. And then keep in mind other changes like free fares. A lot of agencies didn't charge fares. So there are so many kind of counteracting forces, what was happening during that time. And from what I showed you, again, none of that has been accounted for, but we are trying to get much more in depth to address things like Laurel brought up in the chat in the next stage of the research. So stay tuned, give us another 6 months or so, and then hopefully we'll get back to you with some more answers. But thanks for the question.
And then I think she actually had a follow-up comment that agencies set different limits or suggested vehicle capacity, but theoretically you could pick a common one. So I think she's giving you some hints on how she might model this for lack of data. So thanks, Laurel. I don't see other questions or other things in the chat. So just to close out, to give Calvin and Deborah a chance to jump in one more time, do you want to give just a big picture, last minute sort of, your perspective on all of your research related to COVID as it comes towards transit agencies, sort of policy advice or high level thoughts to help transit agencies, because we have many listening in.
Sure. I mean, the big thing that I have been thinking about related to transit, and I'm not a transit expert, but particularly, but the big thing I've been thinking about, and I've been hearing transit agencies talk about this, so it's not new information, but just that ridership, the way that it was before, just isn't likely to come back in the same way. And sometimes when I actually just the other day I got a comment on something I'd written which basically said that, and the person was like, well, I said something about how telecommuting was a good thing, and like, well, won't it hurt transit agencies? Was the comment I got. And I said, well, yes, but it'll hurt transit agencies in a way that but like forcing former commuters who could telecommute back to work is not the way to fix that problem, I feel like, right? You don't want transit agencies to be kept afloat because they're serving trips that aren't actually that useful, because the people could just as easily and maybe more happily work from home. So I think that though that it is really important for transit agencies to figure out how this new landscape of their customers, what does that really look like? And like I said, I've heard transit agencies already having these conversations and trying to figure this out and figure out how to serve that new, somewhat changed landscape of who are their customers. So that's my 2 cents.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Calvin, do you want to jump in too?
Yeah, I mean, I think I already touched on this a little bit towards the end of my presentation, but I think sometimes transit agencies are separate from the agency that is, or the department that is making the decision or setting the regulations for a scooter share or a bike share system. And I would just encourage a little bit more, cross collaboration. I think personally, I see scooters and bikes working best as that first mile, last mile complement to public transit. And so the more coordination, the more integration, both in terms of software, a lot of transit agencies have trip planning software that we can integrate into and help people just make that connection more seamlessly. But also in terms of, operations of scooters matching the operations of our transit systems in sort of a hand in glove way rather than a disjointed way. Because as I mentioned, scooters get you directly or very close to where you start, the origin of your trip, and can more or less get you exactly to the destination of your trip, which transit doesn't do. But if we can have some reliability on where you can find scooters, especially around public transit stops, I think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration there. So that's my 2 cents.
Great. Well, it is already 8 after, so I'm going to cut things off there and thank all 3 of you very much for joining us today and telling us about your research related to COVID. Chad, I think we go to a 20-minute break now, or a 21-minute break.
Correct. Yes, we will be back at 3:30 Eastern and 12:30 Pacific. Thank you so much. Okay. Hello and welcome back. We have some great guests today for the special session with special speakers on transit data and technology. We have 2 presentations. One will be on translating transit analytics research into practice, challenges, and models. And then we also have another presentation on smart traffic data for operations and optimization. Joining us are Brendan Hemley, a senior advisor for the Transit Analytics Lab of the University of Toronto Transportation Research Institute, and AC Roberts from WGI, and Justin Dennis from Urban SDK, and Jonathan Bass also from Urban SDK. So we will first have a presentation by Brendan Hemley, and then we will have the presentation by AC, Justin, and Jonathan. To give a little bit more background on Dr. Hemley, he serves again as a senior advisor for the Transit Analytics Lab at the University of Toronto Transportation Research Institute. He is an independent consultant with 38 years of experience of working with the transit industry in both Canada and the United States, specializing in transit policy, planning, management, and technology issues. He provided support to US DOT from 2007 to 2018 related to Transit Urban Transit Association, CUTA, where he was responsible for all research and technical activities. He is past chair and emeritus member of TRB's Public Transportation Planning and Development Committee and is the current chair of TRB's Public Transportation Group. AC Roberts from WGI leads the Traffic Systems Group at WGI, which includes traffic system design, TSMO, ITS, and CVAV efforts. He has over 20 years of experience in the deployment of traffic and safety solutions that advance technology in the market space, while also meeting clients' budgetary requirements. AC has a national portfolio with multiple ITS America award-winning projects and is currently focused on advancing AV and traffic operation systems to sharply reduce traffic accidents. Then we have Justin Dennis, who is the co-founder and CTO of Urban SDK. He leads the Urban SDK team of software engineers, data analysts, and technical project management to provide innovative data and analytic solutions for transportation, mobility, and safety planning. Recently, Justin was honored as Jacksonville Business Journal's Ultimate Technology Leaders 2021 and has been selected as a speaker at Move America, Transpo, AMPO, and Venture Atlanta. He is an external advisor to University of Florida Transportation Institute and a graduate of Stetson University. He is in Ponte Verde Beach, Florida, with his wife, daughter, and son. And finally, we have Jonathan Bass from Urban STK, who is the director of marketing there. So we're going to turn it over to Dr. Hemley. Brandon, please.
Okay. So, hello all. As Chad mentioned, my name is Brendan Hemley. I'm an independent consultant, long time, and a senior advisor for the Transit Analytics Lab at the University of Toronto. My career has sort of been on both sides, as Chad mentioned, of the fence. I've worked for the Canadian Urban Transit Association for 15 years, which is the Canadian counterpart to APTA. But in parallel to all that, I've been very involved at TRB with the academics and researchers there, with the Transit Planning Committee, and then now I chair the entire public transportation group. The whole concept of research into practice has been a lifelong interest. And so I've taken advantage of this conference and this presentation to try to bring together some thoughts. I've organized some sessions at TRB on this topic. And so I'm going to take a bit of a different angle than a lot of the people and presenters here. A lot of the presentations are sort of aspirational of what you could do with data or case studies of what has been done with data. But as somebody who's been looking at technology and the use of data for a very long time, I want to take a look at from the other side of the sort of the perspective of why has progress been so slow when there are so many things that one can do with data. And so sort of that is the back end theme, and possible throw out some thoughts of what might be done. So I like history, and I'm gonna, since I've been involved in this industry for a long time, I'm going to sort of provide an arc of how ITS data and analytics has progressed. And then I'm going to look at challenges to deployment. So I'm looking primarily from the perspective of academic research, applied academic research into practice, and some of the challenges that'll go through sort of two categories of challenges, and then suggestions of what can be done. So first, the Transit ITS data analytics arc. I guess the main point here is to illustrate that we've known, at least some transit agencies and some researchers have known for a very long time, that the data produced through the automated systems, the ITS systems, could be a valuable tool for improving efficiency and effectiveness. And so ITS sort of really started in the 1980s, and it sort of evolved in North America, first in Canada and then the US. And when I was working for the Canadian Urban Transit Association, CUTA, I organized the first international conference on AVL way back in 1988, where there already was a session on using AVL data. From that, a project that looked specifically collated the types and uses of AVL APC data for planning and management that were already being used by some transit agencies in those days. Progress was rather slow after that. Mid-1990s was a very long process of evolving AVL systems. There was two seminal reports related to the use of data, TCRP Report 113, led by my colleague Peter Firth. And I was on the team and organized a workshop with suppliers, and TCRP 126 would look at ITS data for market research. This is a table of the examples of uses of data that we had identified in 1991. They were not fancy, they were tabular, but there were examples of service planning, operations planning, and executive management. So it dates back that long, but it's been, as I'll illustrate, it's been rather a very slow process to get to the point where we are today. It was really almost 20 years later that we really start seeing suppliers stepping up and providing analytic modules, dashboards. 2014, TRB created a transit data subcommittee that is now a full-blown committee. The first transit data workshop brought together a small number of academics interested in applied research and how you could use smart card data. I'll come back to that. And finally, we're getting to the point that some systems are finding the technology is mature and start focusing on the use of data. But what this means is that the gaps between the leaders who as early as the 1990s knew that you could use data, majority of industry has been growing over time. We've had real progress, and I'm very optimistic about that in recent years. People realize that the ITS data is a valuable resource, and there's a lot of discussion within the industry of business intelligence, data analytics, decision support systems, open data, big data, so forth. And COVID really brought forward the importance of data. What has changed? Well, the systems have become more mature. It's become easier to access the data. Suppliers are providing the data as part of modules, new visualization analytic tools, increased discussion of use cases. And this coincides with the general interest with big data and smart cities and so forth. As I mentioned, a small group of academics and a few others, including myself, have been involved in a series of workshops, transit data workshops that started back in 2014, focusing on smart card data, expanded over the years with other workshops looking at more AVL data, operations-based applications, increased focus on passive data, new applications, leading to last year's Transit Data 2020 that was co-organized by myself and my colleague, Professor Amar Shalabi at the University of Toronto. In that conference, Amar and I really tried to make sure that there was a mixture of academics and practitioners. And we were successful. There were 250 participants. It was a virtual conference. 2/3 were practitioners, 100 speakers from 19 countries, 13 lightning presentation sessions, 9 plenary sessions. It really was very heartening to see that more and more transit agencies are really understanding that data is important. But there are still lots of transit systems that are really still struggling with just getting their heads around and systems set up and managements and governance so that they can use the data on an ongoing basis. Through these workshops and through a report that I'll show you in a minute, we've identified a typology of what you could do with all this ITS data. It can be used for systematic monitoring at very high level, dashboards, executive management. Really big focus is on service operations planning, on-time performance, scheduled adherence, running time analysis, operator performance, strategic analyses, campaigns, major redesigns, tactical analyses, delays by intersection, locations for priority treatment, excessive stop dwell time, stop consolidation, exploratory data mining, decision support for real-time operation control. I've made other presentations about this, and if you're interested and you're a member of APTA, you can go to APTA Connect, to the IT subcommittee, APTA Connect bulletin board, and you'll find the presentation there, or you can contact me. My email will be. But here's the heart of the issue. Why is it so hard to apply transit analytics applied research? And as I've thought about this and discussed this with colleagues, there's really 2 categories of challenges. The first one relates to the internal challenges that transit agencies face themselves in trying to use ITS data and analytics. And there's a number of reasons for this. A lot of these are outlined in a report that I prepared, 20-page report for ITS America and the US DOT on the use of the ITS data, and it identifies the challenges. Just briefly, I'm sure that the transit systems that are listening in will relate to this. There are technical challenges. There are significant technical challenges to get up to speed. Normal corporate data management challenges, I'll leave those aside, but challenges related to ensuring data quality. a lot of these systems were not designed to create data. AVL systems were designed for security. Smart card systems were designed for managing revenue, and so they weren't specifically designed for ITS. So it took some years for them to evolve in ways that to be useful in that way. There are many factors affecting data quality. There are challenges in matching and cleaning data, and there's challenges even once you have cleaned the data and sort of set up your own quality assurance process. Sure, many of you will relate to these. Hopefully, many of you are past this stage of having to sort of resolve issues related to the imprecise geocoding of bus stops, multiple bus stop inventories and IDs, data matching problems with the scheduling and AVL systems because of layover locations and loops and branches and negative loads and so forth, multiple sources of GPS location, factoring up samples, linking data to schedule actual service, adjusting to ever-changing schedules and bus stops. But the organizational challenges are probably even more significant. Lack of resources, lack of technical expertise and tools, difficulty in recruiting data specialists even when you want to, data management and governance issues, increasing external pressure about accountability and open data and privacy and performance-based management, which are sometimes in contradiction with each other. And a lot of it stems from many transit agencies, a lack of interest from senior management policy boards. There's confusion over benefits and strategies, and if they don't support the need for data and the use of data, then you don't get the expertise and tools to use that data. The second group of, even when transit agencies recognize the need, value in data and want to set up systems, there's always an inherent problem, challenge for researchers and transit agencies to collaborate. And as I was thinking about this, there's a number of issues. First, differences in perspectives. Academics tend to have longer term focus, often primarily focusing on methodologies, while transit agencies have a shorter term focus on problem resolution and solutions. And when they focus on short-term problems to be resolved, they'll tend to rely more on consultants for problem solving than investing in longer-term academic type research. Academics, what do they need? They need data. They need they can serve two sources, publicly available, there's more and more of that, open data, new tools like passive data, or private data that come from the transit agencies directly. And why do they need the data? And what's their objective? The system is structured to encourage them to publish as much as they can in journals that are very not accessible to transit agencies. It actually, the academic system does not reward doing practical applications in most cases because practical applications are not publishable. So it takes a special efforts to engage transit partners. And I tell my friends in the academic world, collaboration requires mutual interest. Deploy the applications, even when you have a cool concept, a cool tool, you have to have a partner that's interested. And this requires ongoing communications. It requires trust. It requires access to the data, and there's issues of data cleaning and filtering, getting an understanding of the data dictionary, and maintaining privacy protection. And then there's the issue of intellectual property. The data belongs to the transit agency, as it should. Hopefully that issue has been resolved. You own your data. But the IP typically belongs to university in any collaboration. And so most common format I see is that data belongs to the transit agency, the IP belongs to the university, but the transit agency gets an irrevocable license to always use any resulting application. And dissemination as a result of all this remains a fundamental challenge for deployment transfer applications. I was very happy to hear Mary's comments this morning and the fact that this new research into practice RFP that they're evaluating is being considered and will be put in place. I think that'll help and go a long way. But journal articles, as I mentioned, only reach other academics. The language the researchers use do not, often researchers have a problem, don't know how to message their concepts, tools, and analyses in ways that transit agencies can digest them. TRB, I'm a big advocate of TRB, but it really reaches small number of best practices transit agencies, as well as consultants and other academics. Associations play an important role, but somewhat limited effectiveness in this respect because academics are not part of associations. I found many discussions, the really long-term benefit of collaboration is the placement of students in transit agencies in consulting, which ups the game, ups the knowledge of use of data. It's promising, but it's a long-term. And though I'm focusing primarily on sort of academic research into practice, vendors and consultants, most vendors and consultants respond to industry RFPs. If transit agencies aren't seeking innovative solutions, they will not tend to get them. It's a very low margin environment, so it's really challenging for firms to develop new tools and be successful in convincing this conservative industry to adopt them. There are many new startups these days because tools are more widespread and there's all sorts of cool things being developed. Technology, AI, et cetera, facilitates innovative developments, but it's challenging for startups to translate research into profitable products in a conservative age. So it remains research, technology, innovation, use of data remains challenging. But here's some thoughts just to throw out there. First of all, transit agencies need to really more and more need to identify the value in data analytics. So what does this require? It means making the case to policymakers and management through use cases, return on investment, more focus on visualization. It means facilitating technology transfer, messaging by researchers, TRB committees, dissemination through the UTCs, such as this conference, APTA, CTAA. There's, I should mention, there's a TRB, TCRP G18 project, which is really developing interface mechanisms so that there can be a wider use of both sharing of data and data tools that emerge from data. And in terms of academic transit collaboration, communications partnerships to build trust, quid pro quo. So before I was using this before it became a less savory lane. Data quality assurance methodologies, guidance on uses, training, new analyses, visualizations, value to senior management, messaging, refocus educational programs to focus more on data science and business analysts. So there's a 4-step framework I see. Data collection, that responsibility lies with the transit agency that owns the data. Transform data into information. This is where academics can play a key role, cleaning the data, developing tools to automate cleaning and transformation of data, but especially then the analyses, the many potential applications, recommendations, the vetting by transit agency, and finally the using the results to inform policy and decision, but that responsibility lies with the transit agency. So to wrap up, there's sort of 3 collaboration models. The vast majority of researchers, when they interface with transit agencies, it's through ad hoc requests. It's the most common approach, but probably the least effective. You request data, little recognition of need for mutual interest. There's no such thing as free data. Any effort to provide data is a significant effort by the transit agency. Depends whether they participate or not, depends on the interest and culture at the transit agency. Step above that would be to ensure a regular dialogue and engagement, build trust and interest, perhaps start on focus on educational aspects, and then provision of data to test applications and their value. And then the sort of the holy grail would be ongoing multi-year collaboration. A few agencies that I know, colleagues in a small number of universities around the world have managed to develop this framework where it confirms the value of the longer term perspective. There's a longer term commitment between the transit agency and the university, enables enables those collaborations to survive changes in leadership and meets academic time horizon, and focus on projects that satisfy both academic and practitioner interests, and really helps to create a stream of bright, well-prepared students for work. So those are a couple thoughts that I had. I just wanted to share with you about, having watched this for a long time, what are the challenges and what would it take to get more academic applied research into this? There's my address. You can contact me if you want that discussion paper. You can Google it and find it somewhere. The TAL website, the Transit Analytics Lab, there's a lot of information there. We're trying to share that information, engage the university. That's the that's the name of the discussion paper, and I think it's hyperlinked, and you can find it or just Google it and you'll find it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Really appreciate you bringing up some really important issues that we'll get to in our questions period. AC, Justin, and Jonathan, time is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can share our screen. All right, is that look correct to you guys?
Looks great.
All right, so I'm AC Roberts. I'm TSM&O manager at WGI. We are a Florida-based firm, consulting engineering firm, but we are, work nationwide, mostly from Texas to Florida and a little further north there. But this transit agency work, I'd like to talk about it from a perspective of more of the infrastructure. Justin, feel free to introduce yourself. He has a slightly different perspective than I did.
Hey everyone, Justin Ennis, co-founder CTO of Urban SDK. We are a mobility analytics platform providing near real-time insights into how cities move.
We are working together, our two firms, on delivery of some projects. So we'll talk about some practical aspects of how these systems and data systems are set up for transit, but also how these systems can benefit larger transportation agencies as a whole. We'll also talk about kind of looking towards the future, connected and preparing, using these systems to prepare agencies for automation and automated operations. So I'll start us off here a little bit and get into some case studies that Urban SDK has worked on. Traditional data sources of traffic is really changing, but there's a lot of varied sources for traffic data currently. You have all sorts of different agencies. Traditionally, this information has been a siloed perspective from different agencies, and different programs set up their own data collection efforts, and it's a lot of duplication of efforts, honestly, between different agencies and different divisions, even inside the same agency. So there's the process up to this point has just been trying to gather these different data feeds, try to put them into one big data structure so that you can actually do something with the data. So much of our effort from the Department of Transportation and agent and consulting agencies has been just to do that, to set up the framework, to begin building those data feeds from different detection systems, Bluetooth and all the different roadside communications, even video, detection and analytics, and work zones in some states is a big part of this structure, and how to ultimately, we love to be able to get that good origin destination data, location-based service data, so that we can tell where people are actually going to, and in real time, how to better manage and operate our programs to better, meet the needs of the public. And Justin, feel free to jump in if for any of these issues. On the operations side, it's been a lot of just monitoring those systems from videos, monitoring the detection capabilities, what that vary, quite honestly, between agencies. But by and large, it's human-based decision making. It's there's a process, right, from an incident occurring or an accident occurring on the roadway, or a failure on the operations of a transit bus. There's a process from noticing that event to going through a planned response program and getting checks and balances along the way before you respond and actually restore that section of road to free operation. So there is a variable period of time there that we really want to try to focus on using data to try to minimize that time. And that could take place on a freeway or a transit system or on an arterial street. As programs become more automatic, you start to have signal timings that are more responsive in real time to traffic and transit and priorities along the way. You start to slow down or speed up actually that process, and the response is faster ideally. And so you have a rules-based analysis so that you can kind of quickly respond to incidences and get those roadway sections open to traffic. There's a lot of new private data sources that are starting to feed into that. Anything that we can do to operate or to communicate with the public is warranted or acknowledged. Things like Google Maps or Waze, or even some of the interfaces that you're starting to see between those companies and programs like Waycare to really be that go-between between state agency operations and the public-facing Waze and Google Maps. The dashboards that are currently being used for this type of performance measures and traffic data is really just based on the data that you have in a different agency. This is an example of a dashboard purely built off of Bluetooth data, but it's a good foundational program that you can check real-time data for Bluetooth speeds, and eventually you'd be able to add whatever detection platforms that you have, from radar detection or video detection, to provide the volume piece, which really starts to build a more robust performance measures dashboard. Making it visual allows you to quickly notice or graph things, as you can see on the bottom, of real-time traffic volumes versus historical traffic volumes. So you can just sort of visually see in a graphical format, as if you're having an event at a certain intersection or corridor that doesn't look normal or doesn't fit the traditional pattern of traffic that you historically see at that period of the day. If you have an abnormal volume during lunch or even at a rush hour event where it's abnormal, you can visually see that quickly, and you can color code those sections of roadway that seem to be causing you problems. A lot of different systems, vendor-based performance measure systems are coming out. Things like the MyoVision system here on your bottom right allows you to really get a more granular view and to build different data sources and feeds there. As you can see, you can kind of tile those different systems together to create a nice dashboard. It's more off the shelf than something that would be created from scratch like this Bluetooth system. And certainly State of Utah's ATSPM system has really improved everyone across the nation's focus on traffic signal timing and keeping those systems up and running, and really digging into the maximum efficiency of traffic signal timings. One other thing I wanted to mention on the dashboards is things that are being tracked or that may not be tracked everywhere is near misses. So we do a good job of detecting a lot of accidents and a lot of volumes and speeds, but sometimes the near misses or the near accidents can be more beneficial for certain roadways, because if you can track that, or if you can track situations where people are violating typical traffic laws, then you could address that before accidents occur or before you have a major accident. So I'll turn this over to Justin for a little while here to go through some of his projects and some of the specific use cases for this data.
Yeah, thanks, AC. So we we work with a number of MPOs throughout the nation, and typically they are responsible for making long-range transportation and mobility plans. And so I think as we think through data, both in the transit agency, you have very operational metrics and data that can lead to on-time performance improvements, route decisions, ridership decisions. Sometimes that data doesn't translate itself very well to the planning organizations. And so some of our work has really been around helping those organizations collect data from better, more reliable sources, establish regional collaboration through data, and then have tools that can help them understand the insights without necessarily having to have the in-house expertise. And so some of this work is really about allowing organizations to make greater use of the data for long-range plans. And for one instance here in Broward County, Florida, and the MPO there, a part of their congestion and mobility plan was also taking a look at non-motorist capabilities. So looking at areas of bike lanes and its relation to transit and population, as well as income areas that they wanted to focus on. So one of the goals was to increase non-motorist accessibility as well as metrics in particular census tracts of greatest need. And so what we're able to do is collaborate with the transit agency through the use of the general transit specification, general transit feed, and then combine that with census data as well as ridership information to begin looking at areas of need from both an operational perspective as well as a long-range planning perspective. All of these capabilities are publicly accessible through the Broward MPO website as well. So if you are interested in a more dynamic exploration of visualization of the data, you can find that on the Broward MPO website. AC, if you want to go to the next one. And again, so some of this is very similar to that visualization there. It's just looking at the accessibility from those particular data sets. Another use case in more real time is with our work with the Department of Transportation. So again, it's sitting on top of those systems that AC pointed out to, is now also understanding crash rates in more real time. So this is another visualization looking at crash rates by corridor. This can impact, obviously, transit routes and determining safety for pedestrians as well as for your bus drivers. And then another example, just very quickly, is using location-based services data to understand whether or not the system is providing access in the areas of greatest demand. So what we are doing here in Memphis is actually a combination of location-based data services. So the yellow plots, it's very hard to see on this image, but the yellow dots are actually aggregation of the highest origins of trips. So where are people needing a ride from? We derive that from location-based services data. So that can be mobile advertising data, mobile applications, and connected vehicles. And so we aggregate that with about a 4-day latency across a network of about 110 million devices to begin looking at, well, not only where is ridership within the transit system, where are we collecting today, but are we actually providing services in the areas where our cities are most active and where our citizens are the most active. And so you can see really quickly yellow dots of generating popular origins, and then the white and green dots are the actual stops and routes. And visually it becomes very apparent to where you can base mobility hubs, where you can place micromobility, or where you can add specific shuttles or types of stops to get aligned with the actual movement of your city.
All right, I wanted to briefly touch on the project that me and Justin are working together here for Jacksonville Transit Authority. They have great visionary plans for the city of Jacksonville. This is just one small piece of a larger smart city initiative that they are doing citywide to upgrade their transit system to also include autonomous vehicle transit. We are deploying an autonomous transit system downtown around the Jacksonville Jaguars football stadium down to downtown. It's about a 3.5-mile loop initially in the first phase. And then they will expand that out, as you can see, through different regions of the community to potentially use an existing Skyway monorail system to kind of retrofit that system to a rubber tire AV system. So this will be a very cutting edge project, one of the most unique, certainly the largest AV project in the nation once this gets going. We're just sort of beginning the design process currently with the infrastructure and getting that underway. This is going to have also a large component for data and transit and operations that Justin will talk about. And a lot of it's what's unique to me is that it's using a transit forward approach for funding, for planning, and for services to expand the existing transit systems, new AV systems, as well as some adjacent agencies and traffic needs throughout the region. So Justin, if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. So what the crux of this is, how do we run an autonomous fleet? And if you're thinking through data, now you're dealing with vehicles that are generating terabytes of it, every service hour. And not only are they generating the data from their LiDAR and video equipment, but they need to consume real-time data from the edge as well to operate safely. Just based on where the technology is today, these vehicles still need to rely on the environment around it if they're going to operate in mixed traffic, which is what makes this a unique and challenging project. Is not only moving from an automated people mover that is on a elevated monorail down to grade. And AC, you can talk a little bit about sort of the design thoughts of that, but then also how are you moving, these shuttles down a route and through mixed traffic? Well, downtown Jacksonville is not the most popular urban area. It does have workday traffic as well. So what we're additionally doing is working with multiple partners from hardware at the edge, so things like LiDAR sensors and connected traffic signals, all the way through to a supervisory system. So how do we manage the actual fleet of vehicles as they operate? But then also warehousing all of this data so that we can begin to analyze and create more dynamic routes, more dynamic service offerings based on ridership, based on actual densities of population downtown and service needs. And so the future of transit is largely data driven as soon as you bring in the machines to and let them run freely. But AC,
right,
and
I was just going to say that there's a lot of systems going on here between existing and new programs that we're bringing to JTA, but cybersecurity and network threats are at the forefront of our concern, and so we're setting up a system architecture, and we have many partners on this team that will help us evaluate and set these systems up to be a little bit easily separated from their existing operations, so that in some cases you like things to be integrated fully and completely connected, but in some of these cases it's more advantageous from the current cybersecurity environment to have these things firewalled or easily firewalled. So there's a large data and software component to this project. So that does lead us into sort of those future thoughts in this space. As data changes and as we start to see more of this connected and autonomous vehicle systems bringing in data, there's some agencies that may want all that data that Justin was talking about. They may want to take on those terabytes of information so that they have complete control over it. There's there's some concern, or well, not even concern, is some hope that all that data will be very valuable, for future systems and for agencies in the future. So they want that data and they don't want it screened out, whereas some just don't have the capabilities or the staff to handle, that data component. So they want that edge case where it filters out some information. And certainly OEM information and private data sources are increasing, so that you can, potentially purchase or get the information that you want specifically. And Justin, if we're using more of a data lake approach on this project, if you kind of want to talk just high level about that versus more data cloud computing, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, so transit agencies today, you are mostly not set up to like as a data first organization, if you will, but you're being thrust into having need for expertise, having need for CTO, CIO, CISO type roles, and then data teams to support them. So one of the things that we are working through and working on this project is a operational data bus. Is how can data be sent and made available to other systems that need to be connected to this lake at any time, with archiving thought processes to maintain a cost operation, right? Like all of this data has a cost associated with it. And so the more data you run in the cloud, the more data you process through the cloud, the more expenses you have. So we'll be using a data lake architecture it's actually a hybrid cloud, a mix of existing on-premise space and storage, and then cloud infrastructure to just pass information along between the systems that need it at that time. There's going to be accepted latency, and so some things will, the devices will communicate to one another, and they won't make it back to the agency until later on that evening when the vehicle comes in for recharge. So I think one of the biggest things is thinking through in this new generation is what are the operations going to look like in order to make the best use of data and turn it into business intelligence.
Yep. Another next step that we see on the horizon is next level operation systems, digital twin environments, so that you can really simulate your transit routes, or simulate construction activities, or simulate new widening activities or capital projects in your city, and to potentially just improve the operations of traffic around those events, or to improve the existing travel apps, improve these existing systems that you have to best push traffic around through your city. But you have to have that digital environment. And of course, the larger that system gets, the larger the computing power needs become. And there are starting to see D-Wave, Google Cloud or Google Quantum, and even Microsoft and others are getting into this quantum environment where those decisions can be made a lot faster. This is not quite ready for prime time use, but there are demonstration projects going on already for this exact use case, and so it can see the operational need for a large transit system or a large traffic signal system. And Justin, if you want to talk about the future of visualization and how important that is for as things become more automated.
That's right. As you mentioned, quantum computing, you mentioned digital twin. A lot of that is going to be computer modeling and scenarios that are fun to see play out in front of our eyes. But you can't visualize an entire city movement without like having data structured, having data thought through, and then creating a whole new set of visualization tools that can help plan your organization better. Whether it be safety and events that can be seen through the eyes of these machines, or the ridership and ridership demand, or even asset tracking.
And as automation becomes more prevalent, you still have to have that human to verify or to see when things are not operating correctly or as they should. So having that easy visualization is really important even as things become automated. So we'll end here. So we'll have time for questions, but the ultimate goal is just to make things safer for the public and to make those decisions, operational decisions and transit operations more efficient. So it's a fairly low cost way to do these systems rather than building new track or new lanes of pavement. So we definitely see the benefit there for autonomous systems. So we'll turn that back over now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justin, Jonathan, and AC. Some really great points there about how to use, the data future and bringing it in today. So we do have some great questions for the panel. The first one comes from the YouTube chat feed, and it says, this is from Dr. Watkins. I have been working to make TCRP academic partnerships work better on both sides through mentoring of possible academic preliminary or principal investigators. But I'm curious what else you think an individual researcher can do. So I believe this is aimed at Brendan.
Thanks, Carrie. Not easy. I think the issue is, how do you build ongoing communications and trust? If you don't have that, and you just sort of show up and sort of knock on the door of the transit agency and say, oh, I'd like your AVL data for the last 2 years, it's just not going to work. So different tools, different mechanisms, inviting. First, you have to identify who your potential, who you can interface with and who might have interest in a somewhat longer term perspective and involvement in research. So once you've identified them, reach out to them, invite them to do presentations at classes. I know some courses have design classes where they're looking for projects for team efforts. Once you've engaged with them and they've been involved and they can see some of the value or some of the sort of stimulate their interest, that's a starting point for an ongoing dialogue. Inviting them to do presentations at classes. Some of the bigger universities have seminar series where you invite them, and so that there's an interface between them and the academics and the students. It's a process. And it depends on the, different transit agencies have different cultures. A lot of it sometimes depends on the region where they are. So it's just a matter of trying to develop that ongoing dialogue. So then when you do need to approach them for data, then trust. Start with just trying to get data on a pro bono basis. There may be, for longer term, special programs that you can use. I know there are in Canada. I don't know in the US, but that are multipliers so that whatever investment they make, it's multiplied 2 or 3 times through the research councils. Different mechanisms like that, but can't just sort of not show up and knock on the door, because there is all those challenges about different language, different perspectives, and so forth. And there's one other issue which is quite challenging, which is the IP, or it comes out of the analyses. One of the reasons that, if you go through university, it's open. It's because the academics are trying to publish results. The results may not be flattering. So that's a sensitive issue. It's another reason why transit agencies tend to go to consultants, where it's, they don't like what comes out of the analysis and nobody sees it. So there's a number of issues. I hope that sort of gives some thoughts, but it's challenging. It's part of the reason why it takes time to develop those kinds of relationships.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brendan. Here's one that came up is, what are the pros and cons of using transit priority systems for transit vehicles?
So I could take that. So So, there's priority systems that are typically used for emergency vehicles. You're starting to see some operations, some transit agencies use that for transit vehicles. There's some really good situations where that can be beneficial. We've seen that in specifically a project in Orlando just recently where they used it as a pedestrian safety improvement procedure to move traffic in more of a platoon fashion across the area near University of Central Florida. It's a lot of pedestrians, a lot of bicycle riders, for kids going back and forth to school, and transit can sort of platoon traffic with it as it goes along through these corridors. Now, as you start to get, more heavy volumes of traffic, that can be very disruptive. As you start to get each intersection more responsive to traffic as opposed to a specific timing plan, so you no longer have platooning of traffic between signals, and so that can be a problem. So it's definitely is a good case for simulation and study. Just depends on the characteristics of traffic in your area, and some agencies love transit priority. Some really don't like it, and it just depends on the characteristics of traffic. But it's a very real strategy, and it can definitely improve safety if traffic is moving in a more predictable fashion, I would say.
Excellent. Yeah, I know one of the things about transit priority is making transit a more attractive option by reducing the travel times, but that does come with some trade-offs, absolutely. We have another question. You mentioned quantum computing in your presentation. And so is quantum computing a viable option for transit agencies? And are there any examples of quantum computing trials, specifically in transit?
Well, I would say that it's being studied. I would say there's some demonstration projects that I think have been very promising. One specifically in Lisbon, Portugal, Volkswagen sponsored a transit-based quantum study for transit vehicles, more minibuses around Lisbon, and discovered that was very beneficial. Now, those are not fixed route transit buses. Is more of a modular or almost like a ride share scenario where they could change routes based on the volume or the participants or the riders, and maybe that becomes a bigger part of transit business, especially as we start to see more smaller vehicles, more of the shuttle operations where they could pick and choose. The routes are no longer fixed for certain types of transit. So that's a good example. There's a larger citywide study being done in Seattle. It hasn't quite gone to a full quantum study or quantum calculation, but that's the ultimate goal there, is to simulate the city of Seattle and to use quantum computing to calculate the best way to get across. And it would eventually be some sort of a public interface app there for that scenario.
Excellent. And so you mentioned a lot of partnerships between the researchers, and I'm sure there's private entities in there, and then also with the public agencies. And I think both presentations really touched upon the need to connect, the transit agency, maybe a state or other public agency, private entities, and then researchers together. What are some ways that you would recommend to promote these types of partnerships so we can foster that adoption of innovative research and technologies? So opening it up to the whole group.
Brendan, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think there's been an evolution. I've gone to a lot of conferences where suppliers tend to just promote a fairly straightforward sales pitch, but we've evolved now, I think, to case studies where you talk about applications like you did about JTA, and where you bring whoever your partner has been, make the case, because transit agencies tend to listen more carefully to their peers than they tend to do researchers or suppliers. So I think that there's been a very positive evolution in that. I see lots of white papers, through the trade journals being proposed by being made available. So there's more documentation, and that's all good for dissemination and building those partnerships. Couple thoughts.
Justin, if you have any thoughts, but I would say it's always a struggle in a large community when you have so many different players and so many different agencies and organizations. One thing that's made, I think, the JTA project successful is that it has been a very long evolution. I mean, it's taken a long time to get to the point where we actually have some money to spend, and it's just one of those things that has to evolve over time, and it comes down to relationships, and it comes down to public acceptance. Making these projects known in the public domain is so important, and getting that public acceptance and buy-in goes a long way to winning the politicians over, as opposed to going the other route.
Throw out one, building on that. One of the challenges I've seen, which I haven't talked about here, but other places, it's hard enough, as you just mentioned, with a enlightened organization like JTA that had this vision. Those are very few within the transit industry. And the academics tend to work with transit agencies that already have a culture of being interested in a medium to longer term perspective and into the concept of research. The real challenge is, how do we get the vast majority of transit agencies to buy in, to be interested, to try to take it, try to test these things. And I think associations have an important role to play, but government agencies through pilot projects have a critical role. And I think things have gotten better with the FTA. Like with the MOD sandbox and the recent projects, there's been more emphasis on professional capacity building and trying to share that information and share that knowledge. And that's really, really critical, because it's a risk-averse environment. They have to be. It's public. There's transparency, accountability. It's really hard to take risks, and any innovation means taking risks. So it's hard enough for suppliers to try to carry the ball, or the individual transit agencies. They'll do the presentations, adapt, and so forth. But I think there's a really important role for government agencies to provide the risk, the funding, but also the dissemination of the results, so that more and more people are aware of what the potential are, where the future is going.
Exactly. No, you all bring up some really important thoughts about partnerships. I know from a state perspective, we have some pretty strict laws about contracts, about length of contracts, who we can contract with, how we can contract with. So that does make long-term relationships a bit more complicated on many fronts in terms of forging those partnerships on a long-term basis.
But the Cal ITP program is a really interesting example of collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, Cal ITP, absolutely. California Integrated Travel Program, which seeks to make seamless payment between transit agencies within California, is doing some excellent work. And yeah, they're really masterful at getting those partnerships off the ground. And they spoke at our last symposium and had a lot of great insights. We are out of time. Thank you so much, Brendan, Jonathan, Justin, and AC, so much for your time today and for coming to speak to us about these important data topics. Thank you all to the viewers. We will be back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, thank you very much for your time, and you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.